The exit of Aegon the Conqueror and most of his remaining soldiers from the army that he brought into Dorne triggered the defenestration of Sunspear, which featured all of the Targaryen garrisons becoming no more. They were all slaughtered. And the non-Dornish lords who were appointed to administer and rule the subjected territory were treated much the same, with a little extra torture sprinkled in before their lives were ended. Unsurprisingly, this was not the end of the violence, though it never did return to the sort of standard war of armies and sieges and such. It was more of a war of shadows, a war of constant dragon fire raining down despite the war of shadows. It was kind of an unusual variation on this type of war. Sean last time mentioned Vietnam and Afghanistan, and that's very, very appropriate as a parallel. The destruction of many Dornish castles, structures, fields was a constant thing, though maybe not that many Dornish people. The Dornish people were pretty good at staying alive despite all of this hellfire and starvation and destruction being rained on them. From there, it got worse, though. Bounties and assassinations, maimings, other atrocities, each year seemingly worse than the last. Yet, with the passage of time, it seemed clear that very little that either side did seemed to move the needle towards an end. And though Dorne as a whole suffered mightily, arguably the Targaryens lost more in terms of power and prestige. Isn't that often the case with war, though? Nobody wins. Everybody loses. And this one is a particularly bad... good example? No, bad example of... Well, okay, strong example, powerful example, tragic example. Yes, the First Dornish War, the second half of it, has all that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome, everybody. We're back with another episode of Valar Reread for Fire and Blood here on HOW Pod. Every Monday, or every Sunday, rather, we do a live stream. Well, almost every Sunday. When we do live streams, they tend to be on Sundays. The difference, of course, comes during TV seasons, which is usually more like Mondays and Saturdays and other things. But yeah, every video is done on YouTube. And then you can find it on Spotify after it's been edited. So a cleaner copy is up on Spotify and anywhere you find podcasts in audio-only form. And if you want to go with an ad-free experience, go on Patreon and join us there. That's where you get the ad-free versions of every episode.
Is there anywhere you can find a dirtier version?
Yes, the NSFW versions of History of Westeros podcast are available.
History of Westeros.
Nowhere.
History of Westeros at night.
Like, honestly, that's the live version that you're tuning into right now.
That's true.
I should edit this out of the podcast version and you only hear it if you were here live.
Every once in a while, there's like a nip slip here. It just pops right out of my Kingsguard t-shirt here. As you know, I don't know how that would actually happen. Like, how is a nipple going to escape this? Sean, you've got a boy's
Probably
shirt
not.
on. That's also a very strong way to protect your innards.
Yeah. You know, I thought to wear this shirt because it's kind of a bloody, violent show.
Yeah.
About how ambition and revenge can bring out the worst in us.
True.
Featuring characters with superpowers. That's some parallels to this.
That's a good point, yeah. And I've got the Kingsguard shirt on because this is the formation of the Kingsguard happens during this episode. Even though we're not going to focus on that, it does happen, and we're going to mention it. So
there's also another layer. This is a boy shirt, but it's a mashup with the guerrillas, and a lot of guerrilla warfare is featured here.
Okay, so. yes, the different types of guerrilla in play there. That's cool. That's neat. Well, starting this week, by the time you are hearing this, it may have already started, is our Patrons Topics Moot, where those of you who are subscribed to us on Patreon can vote on a whole bevy of topics that will be dropping over the course of the next month or so. And those topics will become episodes during the year. The dates will be TBD, but those episodes will be made, and it is the first of what will be a yearly thing. I expect we'll expand on it next year after we've had one in the books and kind of get a feel for how we want to do it, get some new ideas, and kind of flesh it out a bit more. So it should be pretty fun. So you can all participate in the very first Topics Moot by joining us on Patreon, patreon.com/historyofwesteros. And a shout out to our good friend Nina. She gave us a lot of excellent notes for today. Her blog is at goodqueenalley with 1l.tumblr.com. The latest blog post she's got up there is a question on what were the best times of the Targaryen, like what were the golden ages of Targaryen rule. A straightforward answer is Jaehaerys, but there's other answers, and Nina goes into detail as to why Jaehaerys is thought of the way he is. It's not just a yes him. Well, there's some nice detailed explanations there. I recommend it. If you have questions for us, like I said, that question came from one of Nina's readers. If you have questions for us, you can post them live, and Ashea will hopefully see it. She can't see every comment. She's doing a lot back there. But if she sees it and it's a good question, we will answer it live. If your question is missed or you want to be sure we see it, send it directly to us at westeroshistory@gmail.com or contact us through Patreon or one of the other sites that you're linked to us on. Trivia question for today. The answer will be at the end, but it's also during the episode. I will slyly, or not so slyly, give you the clue to what I'll give you the answer to this question during the episode if you are attentive enough to hear it. Or maybe you already know. What title, created by Aegon the Conqueror, was only held by one man ever? And bonus, if you can name who that person was. The answer to this was actually in the last episode as well, but it's going to be repeated in this one.
I was proud of myself for knowing the answer to this question.
Nice. Good job, Sean. There we go. You're becoming less unsullied all the time. Every day that goes by, you are slightly less unsullied. So I actually, in the intro, called it the second half. I stylishly called it that. But really, it's not really the second half. It's the second portion, because the first part of the war was 2 or 3 years, and that's what we covered last time. This is more like 6 or 7 years, maybe even 8. So it is a longer period of time and a more brutal period of time in a lot of ways, though certainly the last one was pretty darn brutal as well. You got people trapped in rock slides, burned alive, disappearing in deserts of exposure and thirst. Yeah, none of it's very pleasant, but it's all not real. So, here's a passage that best defines this episode. Quote,
Aegon Targaryen was not a man to accept defeat. The war would drag on for another 7 years, though after 6 AC, the fighting degenerated into an endless bloody series of atrocities, raids, and retaliations, broken up by long periods of inactivity, a dozen short truces, and numerous murders and assassinations.
We read that quote last time, but it really bears repeating because it really sets up what's coming here, and we have to sort of imagine what some of these things are. Like, we don't know when any of these dozen short truces are. None of them are specified for us. We don't know what these long periods of inactivity are, that we can kind of imagine them. Maybe winter helped with that, or even though it was not full-blown winter in Dorne, it's still, that would maybe slow things down. At least it's a reasonable guess. What do you think, Sean?
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot left to interpretation there. Like, a short truce might be 1 day, like, and a dozen could be a number thrown out there just to represent, several.
Kind of how they say 1,000 years ago. Yeah, a dozen or so. Yeah, it's not a specific number.
And some of the truces, I wonder, could have been maybe more or less local, maybe this group or this region or this battle was put on hold for a day or a week.
Sure, that makes sense.
But, and maybe sometimes Aegon or some other leader might have said, okay, we're going to hold off for the next 3 months. But that doesn't mean individual people down on the ground didn't still exact their revenge, modern day equivalent of throwing a Molotov cocktail across a wall or something,
Yep. Good point. Yeah. So Fire and Blood summarizes a lot of the war, naming major events from each year, but otherwise it leaves a lot unspecified, which is not a big deal for us. There's enough there for us to go into sandbox mode. It's a good excuse for that. We like sandbox mode, and Dorne is already a natural sandbox, so that kind of works anyway. And Nina adds that it makes the most sense for a historian with the conceit of Gildane because, well, there weren't a lot of traditional pitched battles. Even the way Westerosi historians would write history is challenged by this because they would have had a way of writing about war that's just very tilted towards what Westeros war normally looks like, and this is not what Westerosi war normally looks like. So they might have missed some of the nuance. Like, they weren't necessarily prepared to accurately record it in a way that maybe a more modern, like a real world historian might have some of that experience from having read about these cases elsewhere. But a Gildane or something, well, they would have read about other conflicts between the Reach and Dorne or the Stormlands and Dorne, but none of those conflicts probably were ever anything like this. Certainly didn't have dragons before involved, certainly didn't have an attempt to conquer Dorne. That had never happened from, like, I don't think the Stormlands ever tried to completely conquer Dorne. I don't think the Reach ever tried to completely, if they did, they never got anywhere close to it. So that would be the difference, if not both of those things. So yeah, very different. They don't have like a lot of precedent to draw on in terms of like experience or past writings to give themselves a leg up or a head start or some additional understanding.
It might have even taken a certain passage of time to have the perspective to consider it a war, or having all been a war continuously. Like, I just imagine, like, in the middle of the 100 Years' War, like, even 80 years in, they probably weren't calling it the 80 Years' War. It's
right.
the perspective we had
it's like,
after
damn,
the fact.
It's still 80 years. Jeez, yeah.
Yeah. And partly because it wasn't continuous, right? There were breaks, and it was happening between different factions over a large region, you know, similar to this. And another thing, too, like, you know, the world has gone through different phases and styles of warfare or whatever, but a lot of European history, at least, battles were a little more organized, right?
Mm-hmm.
The armies would agree on a time and place to meet in the field, and sometimes spectators would come to observe it, you know. And but this sort of guerrilla warfare might have been thought of as, like, you know, unfair, or they're cheating, or they're not following the rules, and maybe it's not really even war. They're just like bandits or criminals, or, you know.
And this is probably where a lot of that reputation comes from. Like we see at the beginning of A Song of Ice and Fire, the Dornish have a reputation for like different styles of war. They get accused of poisonings, which you don't really see that very often. Like the Dornish don't actually seem to use poison any more than anybody else. I mean, they do use it, but like I said, it doesn't seem to be like an epidemic or anything, you know.
And it's a little different from the Targaryen side too. This sort of total war that they're exacting, right? Dragons just burning towns down and stuff. That's not normal in Westerosi warfare, and probably not a lot of Planetos in general.
It probably was during the Freehold, like we saw them do that to the Rhoynar, but still, that doesn't make it like normal. I mean, it may have been a part of history, but even they probably didn't just blow up every city, because they wanted to conquer too. Like they usually are subjecting people to their rule, not just annihilating them entirely, though there are exceptions. If it comes to bend the knee or die, they're going to kill you rather than give up their supremacy. And we'll see that.
In the real world, Genghis Khan just, you know, slaughtered every man, woman, child, goat, dog, everything.
You surrender immediately, or it's you get very little leniency.
But that total warfare, and it's not like all Europe was like, oh, I guess that's how we'll do it now. You know, even when we get to like the American Civil War, it was still more like, let's meet Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. and fight at this point with these soldiers, and there was still less guerrilla warfare going on.
So I think that's an important thing, and it's also true as well that maybe just this, for whatever reason, the sources are actually a little stronger. Like we know there's a Conquest of Dorne book written by Daeron the First, and it's very detailed. We don't have it, we don't have a copy of it, but it exists, and we don't know, like, is there a book on the First Dornish War? I mean, there probably is, but it hasn't been referred to. You know, it'd be kind of weird if there wasn't any book on that in world, considering such a major long-term event. But it isn't actually like mentioned or referenced. So maybe they're just, maybe this is like a little bit of a missing piece in Westeros history itself. I mean, there's plenty of examples in the real world of periods of time where we just don't have good sources. So it's a huge story, though, and it sounds really big, and that's part of why I harp on this. That there's a lot of room for interpretation, a lot of room for missing events, a lot of room for expansion of this story someday. Maybe it'll be a TV show. Maybe there'll be additional material written in here. There's a lot of stuff that could be added, a lot of pathos, a lot of characters, and how they feel about it all. That's where there's a lot of room for. Expanding Aegon the Conqueror's personality is a pretty obvious one, but there's so many other people in here. There's so many other characters and that could be added, and some that we know that would just need to be fleshed out, like the Widow Lover and Princess Miria and Visenya and Rhaenys and this various lords of the Hellholt that are going to have a lot of things go wrong for them after their victory there in 10 AC that we're going to get to today.
You know, I can't believe I didn't think to ask or research this before. What was Princess Miria's family like? Did she was really old. Did she have grandchildren, great-grandchildren?
Yeah, she had all that. Yeah, that's going to be a big part of next episode, actually, next week or the week after, because we will be discussing. Like, her family sort of takes a different tack than she does. And yeah,
You don't say.
yeah, right. So it's that's gonna be interesting. But she is a Martell, so yeah, we don't know like if she had brothers or sisters, and she probably outlived them even if she did, because she lived to be in her mid-90s or something. And few real world people lived that long, let alone in Westeros. So
I'm just imagining the drama that could be covered if there was a TV show just about this.
Absolutely.
This event, this time period.
They would flesh that family out. They have some names already, but they would want to add a few more cousins here and there probably. And yeah, it would be very interesting, I think. A lot more interesting, I think, than the conquest itself, which I think is pretty interesting too, but it's not interesting in terms of, who's going to win, or well, that was close, not stuff like that. It would be the character stories that would be written into that. So yeah, Nina also writes, to the extent George wants to compare the First Dornish War to the 100 Years' War, which, Sean, you mentioned the 80 Years' War. It's like, that similar vibes there. And again, this was a point she made last week about how one similarity was that the monarchs of England called themselves kings of France until like the year 1800. And this is kind of similar in that Aegon was calling himself king of the Rhoynar before this war even started. He was calling himself king of the Rhoynar, let alone before Rhaenys went there to demand a surrender that never happened. So, yeah. But again, we're not just focused on the war. There are certain subtopics that we'll save for later because they're too big. But there's a lot of things that happen here in timeline order that kind of get breezed over in the book that we want to draw connections to. Like, it hardly mentions, Fire and Blood barely mentions the fact that Aenys and Maegor were born during this war. It just brings that up later. It's like, by the way, in the year 7, Aenys was born. And it's like, well, wait, that was during the Dornish War. Wouldn't he have been like a target of like, that should change. That should matter. And so I want to draw some of that out because I think it's lacking in the book, and it makes sense to discuss some of those things. And well, that's what we do here. We read between the lines, and if there's not as much to read between the lines, we add it. We do our best with that. So let's continue with the defenestration of Sunspear. To lead ourselves into the newer events. Balon Greyjoy, of all people. Why am I talking about him? Well, he once pointed out that if you bend the knee, you can later rise again and strike, right? No one ever died from bending the knee, is basically what he said. It was like, that's a pretty good point, Balon. It's a good ego-free, like, good way to, get rid of some pride and make some sense. I don't obviously agree with him on his greater point, but yes, forget your pride.
Ned Stark wishes that he was more correct.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah. So, and Dorne did that, basically, without the bending the knee part. They're just like, we're just going to hide, and we will rise again later, though. And they waited for him to leave, like the moment he left. And they had reason to believe that would happen. It wasn't a stroke of luck. Of course, Aegon the Conqueror is not just going to stay in Dorne the rest of his life. He's got a new kingdom to run. He's got a throne, that weird-ass throne he's making up there. He's clearly going to go sit on that and not stay down here. He had a lot to do up there, so it was a reasonable expectation that he would leave. And they may have considered it a stroke of luck, however, how poorly he handled the conquest of Dorne. His policy of dominance through pure martial power was not working. And he didn't adapt to that at all. He just kept attacking and destroying things, and they kept not surrendering. And it was very Sisyphean. Like, clearly that wasn't going to work, but he kept trying. And one thing he didn't adapt to, sticking with this topic of Greyjoys, sort of, is even after it became clear that he couldn't hold Dorne, he still didn't start to use ships and navies. He still didn't adapt to bring that in. And I know I've mentioned this before, but it kind of maybe shows his stubbornness. Maybe his initial plan was really strong, but he was slow to make changes when the initial plan started to fail. And by slow, I mean years and years and years of doing the same thing over and over and it not working. You're muted.
I want to give Aegon maybe a little more credit because he suddenly has a lot more to deal with right now. So, he might be spending more attention on trying to work out trade deals and keep peace between the new lords and all this other stuff. And additionally, it's not crazy to think that this would work. Like, a war of attrition is a thing. And he has the huge advantage when it comes to that. I could see why it might have taken a year or 2 or 3 years for him to shift gears. But it seems like he still didn't even after that. So that's the mistake.
Exactly. He never did shift gears. And you're right. Like, if he's trying to deny them resources, like ships That's a pretty obvious way to do that, like deny them trade.
Yeah.
And that is eventually what happened, but it wasn't because he denied them trade. It's because there was nothing left to trade with. There was just the quote that's going to come later is that Dorne was effectively a smoking ruin. Like, there's nothing to blockade. Like, what ships are going in and out? Like, so it was accomplished a different way, but he could have maybe done that sooner. Anyway. And destroying the Planky Town, which is something we discussed last time, they would have eventually cleared that out and fixed it, but they wouldn't have had an opportunity if they're just worried that at any minute a dragon could return and just blow it all up again. What's the point of rebuilding something that could easily be taken down? And not until the war is over would it make much sense to do that. And if Aegon did start to alter his plans, if we're selling short his flexibility, a clue to that might be how much he listened to the Maesters. Recall that he created the office of Grand Maester, and he did it in the year 5 AC, which is pretty much like right after this war started, started to take shape, but before Rhaenys came and burned the Planky Town. And this first Grand Maester was Aladar, who had been the Archmaester of History. So when we talked before about historical precedent and looking at past wars with Dorne for ideas, for strategies, for things that worked, for details on how to deal with the desert, well, he maybe didn't have much to provide there, and maybe Aegon didn't listen to him. And in any case, the guy didn't live very long, so it may have just been that. It might have been the simplest answer of all. He didn't listen to the man because the man was only in office for a year or so. Actually, less than a year. He was replaced by a man named Leonce, who was the Archmaester of either money or numbers, because we don't know the difference. Like, there's a red gold Archmaester and a yellow gold Archmaester. We don't actually know which is which. One of them is money, one of them is just numbers. So they're kind of related. Either way, this guy was probably very important in setting up new economic policies or advising Aegon on things like taxation and things like that. So it's a pretty important role in a new economy, in a new country, a new region, all that stuff. And this guy would have worked with Crispian Celtigar, the first Master of Coin, who we talked about in our House Celtigar episode last year. Of course, the Grand Maester office still exists, but one that doesn't is the Warden of Sands. And it would have been interesting if there had been a Warden of Sands, if that had stuck. Because he's like, well, Warden of the North, Warden of the South, Warden of the East, Warden of the West. Oh, wait, we need another one. Warden of the Sands? I don't know. We'll call it that. Yeah, Warden of the Sandbox in our case. So yeah, that was that Lord John Rosby fellow who only one to ever hold that title. And so Castellan, he was Castellan of Sunspear, which is for a very short time before they murdered him. And that's the one who Miria pushed out the window herself. Very symbolic. We mentioned that last time. So it's a little different, right? You kind of have to have... This was more of a like occupying force warden rather than you're the guy that is in charge if there's an outside attack. So it is a little different in its conceit.
In time, that might have evolved.
Yes,
but
yes.
They didn't have time for that.
No,
Yeah.
never. Yeah, exactly. And by the time Aegon gets back to King's Landing, he's left. He leaves Dorne. The defenestration of Sunspear happens. We don't know when he hears about it. Maybe there's some messengers that arrive on the road. They're like, "Oh my gosh, King, look what's happened." Maybe he doesn't get the most of the news until he actually arrives back home. We don't know if he marched with the army or if he just flew back on Balerion to get there quickly. If he did, he's certainly not getting any news in the meantime. Ravens don't fly to airborne dragons to deliver messages. I don't know that I needed to clarify that, but it's kind of funny to picture that, right? So he would have... It's quite possible that he had no idea until getting back to King's Landing what happened to Lord Orys. He's like, what happened to Lord Orys' army? Like, it totally vanished. We never saw them. We never heard of them. He might finally find that out when... I don't know, there's maybe some ransom demands or someone, maybe taunting from the widow lover, the Lord Will guy. He seems like he might be willing to do something like that. And that's a big deal. Like, Orys is like the 4th ranked guy in the whole kingdom. You got Aegon, Visenya, Rhaenys, and then him, right? There's no heirs yet. Who would it be? Like, Lord Velaryon isn't that powerful at this point. Orys is their blood relation. He's like their bastard half brother. So he's got to be next in line. And then that includes like the throne. Like if something weird were to happen, Visenya, Rhaenys, and Aegon are all killed. he would have the best claim to the crown. So having him is a really powerful hostage, a really powerful man. So he's the most elevated and connected man in the kingdoms that doesn't have a dragon. So, and at this point, again, this is the year 6. Still no, Aenys is going to be born the next year. So this is like possibly even the guy that some might consider the heir. It's unclear at this point who would have been the heir, but he's probably the best claim, you know? It's hard to see who it could have been. So that's a really big hostage, a really big deal, and it might slow Aegon's response down. He's like, well, if I launch into total war again right away, are they just going to execute him? The answer is no, but it had to be on his mind. So, yeah. Okay, so the year 6 AC, let's go there. Remember last time we discussed a lot about the weather. That's another thing that's not super clarified in Fire and Blood, but we can figure out a lot because we knew there was 2 straight years of autumn. There's no mention of or not 2 straight years, but it entered its 2nd year. We don't know if it went 2 full years. You know, anyway. Maybe an unnecessary clarification, but we're very detailed here at History of Westeros podcast. Winter had almost certainly come by 6 AC if there had been nearly 2 years of autumn in 4 and 5 AC, right? That's a pretty safe assumption, I think.
And there's not some mention later on of winter suddenly coming either.
Right,
so.
Yeah. So the defenestration happened late 5 AC is kind of our guess. The text says that the next phase of the war began in 6 AC, so that all adds up. It's not important to just like completely pinpoint that, but the weather part is what I care about here. Even in much warmer Dorne, it's a bad time to raise armies, to begin a campaign that involves significant manpower. And not to mention how badly the Westeros armies found it. Like, remember, more than half of the soldiers Aegon raised died. And during the actual war part, and then a whole chunk more died when all the garrisons were slaughtered. So you got a lot of soldiers that are like, yeah, I do not want to go back there. Like, morale would be real low.
Yeah, I was going to say, not only do you have that many less soldiers, but it's that more difficult to get any more soldiers now.
Yeah, and harder to feed them. Yeah, so the timing is bad, so it's kind of maybe a respite for Dorne. Timing, a lot of things worked out pretty well for them timing-wise, and they get some credit for maybe building their strategy around it. And after a long autumn, we would expect a longer winter. That's how it works, right? The longer the autumn, the longer the winter, which of course will also mean a longer summer following that winter, which this war is long enough that we need to factor that in too. It's going to help us explain a lot, even if we don't have exact precise dates for when the seasons changed. Though we know things escalated, this may have been one of those periods of relative inactivity. Not a truce necessarily, but one of those implied, like, stuff just didn't happen for a while. The outset of winter, that makes a lot of sense for that. Or the Targaryens thinking they had things settled only for this uprising to happen and them struggling to find a way to respond immediately. Well, we can't just march down there again, so what do? I don't know. Let's talk about it. Well, there you go. Period of inactivity. Boom. Pretty straightforward. But perhaps they just knew they had to wait. Maybe they were like, well, they got us, but we're going to come back. We're going to be prepared next time. So it's like an extension of the Dragon's interim in essence. They wanted to get back at Dorne. They were itching to finish what they started, but the timing was terrible. Establishing new laws and traditions and all that other stuff. They still got others, like we said, there's other things to do. Dorne is not the only concern here. You got to pay attention to the other 6 kingdoms, or however you count them. 6, 7, 8, whatever the number is.
It's another example of something that I can imagine the details and drama of playing out on a show that featured all this. There might be times where, just to save face or to present the people with a victory of sorts, when you know you can't attack anyway, but you can pitch it like, they're too scared of us and they offered a truce. We're like, wow, we weren't attacking anyway. But you can make it seem like you have accomplished something by negotiating a truce. You know?
Yeah, it's a good way to fire up your own side. Just like anything that makes your people a little more confident. I know I've used this example before. It's been a while, though. It's The Wire. Slim Charles once tried to fire up the gang by pointing to some guy that had been murdered, and all the gang thought it was the rival gang that murdered this guy. And then he go back and they're having a meeting amongst the leaders, and the guy's like, yeah, it wasn't them. He's like, what? It wasn't them? He's like, don't tell them that. If it's a lie, we fight on that lie. That's better. Don't sap their morale. If we're going to go fight them, don't take their morale away, even if it's dishonest. Like they're about to go put their lives on the line. You want them to be confident. And, if you're not going to call the whole thing off, don't tell them the truth. It's a similar sort of thing here. Yeah. Dishonesty is not the worst thing in the world. Like it's unethical, but sometimes lying is a good thing. If it's saving lives, like there's no question lying is a good thing.
Lying in of itself, I don't think is wrong. Using a lie to deny someone their rights.
Yeah, okay.
That's wrong.
Yeah, and other examples too. But yeah, just in a vacuum, not all lies are evil or unethical or what have you. And this is one of those times, I suppose, especially if you're on the Dornish side and you're fighting for your country, fighting for your countrymen or your lives, etc. What's a few lies in mixed into that when your lives are on the line, right? Like, so the fall,
especially given all the other atrocities.
Yeah,
right?
a lie doesn't even come close unless that lie is one of the things that led to some of those atrocities. But in most cases, it's not. It's just another raindrop in the storm here, right?
Does this barrel of wine that I'm going to share with my whole household have poison in it? No.
No.
That's a bad lie.
And there is a poison barrel of wine later in the story too. I like that. Good example. Good said, Sean. So the Lord Orys and hostages situation does have a resolution the following year in 7 AC. And still things probably haven't kicked into full second phase of the war yet. I feel like we're still in the interim where things are picking up, but there still hasn't been a second army sent down. There never will be. The dragons haven't returned yet. We haven't seen like the assassinations really kick into gear yet. So I feel like this is still part of that inactivity where people are preparing, they're thinking about what might come next, but people aren't actually actively stabbing each other to death in Dorne or otherwise fighting. So the ransom happens. Lord Orys and his other knights, some of whom were the ones who were important enough to leave alive, are ransomed by Lord Will, the widow lover. And we get an idea maybe why it took so long. The ransom was huge. It's a casually dropped number. Their weight in gold. That's a staggering sum. How much is... I'm about 160 pounds. 160 pounds of gold? If I'm a knight, I weigh more than that probably because I've been training in armor my whole life. I probably have way more muscle. I'm probably like 180 or maybe 190, and there's certainly people larger than me, the 200-pounders. I'm not a very big man. A lot of these guys would be big. Orys himself is a huge man, most likely like a 240-pounder or something like that. 6'4", something big like that. And this is where it's kind of funny, the way you can game things like this. The not funny part is that after the ransom was agreed to, the Wills chopped their hands off so that they could never raise swords against Dorne again, which is like, ouch, but you kind of get it. Like, these were invaders, and if you let them go, they're definitely going to come back. They are going to come back. Like, it's like a guarantee that most of these warriors, including Orys, would come back to fight in Dorne if they weren't. So it's definitely a violation of the implied code of conduct when dealing with hostages, but I kind of get it, you know? Not that I approve, but I'm like... I don't know. It's hard to say
it's hardcore, right? It may be immoral, but it makes sense.
Yeah, it's not just cruelty for cruelty's sake. It's not just we're gonna get one over on these ancient enemies of ours. Like, those stupid Stormlanders. We show them, you know.
They're gonna give us 5 more pounds of gold than they should have.
Yeah. They weighed them and then cut their hand.
5 pounds might be too much. I don't know if your hand weighs 5 pounds.
Does it have its gauntlet on when you cut it up? Yeah. That's how this gets gamed. We saw Roose Bolton game that. Like, Lord Walder Frey's like, I'll give you a bride price in silver. She's like, well, I'll take your largest daughter then. I'll choose Fat Walda. So we're like the Wills like feeding the prisoners extra food. Like, why are they giving us so much food? Like, so then if that happens, they might figure that out. They're like, oh my, you know what? I figured it out. They're gonna weigh us and give us ransom in there. That's why they're fattening us up. It's our weight in gold or silver or something. So then they're like, what are they doing? Like push-ups when the guards aren't watching to like lose that weight. Like, I'm gonna enjoy this food, but I'm gonna lose those calories. I'm not gonna make the crown pay that much for my ransom.
One-handed push-ups?
Yes, Yikes, that's dark. So And remember, House Will already has this reputation. This is the same house that took Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight captive and hung him over a cage, over a pit of vipers, Baelor the Blessed going to rescue him and getting bitten and them laughing about it and all that. This is the same house. They have a reputation. Of course, that hasn't happened yet in this timeline, but it's gonna. And you know that when that does happen with Prince Aemon and Baelor the Blessed, they're remembering this. The Lord Will, the Widow Lover, is still known. He's still infamous in parts for an event that we're going to get to later here in the timeline. So yeah, they remember. They remember.
You know, another piece of this that I wonder about is delivering that gold. Think what an effort that would have been. Like gathering it and then like protecting it along the way. You would have needed a huge force.
That's a good point.
Right? Like there's a lot of motivation for someone to attack that convoy. So.
Yeah, I like the loot train battle in Game of Thrones TV show with, of course, no dragons would have been attacking that because the dragons would be the ones collecting it. But still, you're right. That's a massive amount of gold going a long distance. Yeah.
I wonder if they use dragons to escort it. I didn't even think of that till just now.
Maybe, yeah. Maybe that's a low pride endeavor for a dragon rider, but it might be what was necessary. And
it'd be a dangerous handoff too, especially if the dragons did fall. Like, here's the gold, here's the prisoners. Okay, now burn up all the people that have the gold. Like,
yeah, yeah, right.
That might have been part of the condition. Like, no dragons in sight. We're not handing them over.
Ooh, yeah. Which they might be wary of. Well, why are they doing that? Are they going to do a surprise attack? Like, what? Yeah, like I wouldn't trust the Will, and if I was the Will, I wouldn't trust the Targaryens. So yeah. You just got this lack of trust on both sides, and you can understand why. By the way, the Will sigil is the Black Adder. Blackadder biting a foot, coiled around a foot. It might just be a reference to Blackadder, the Rowan Atkinson show, the medieval historical comedy. But Nina points out it might also be a little bit of a biblical thing.
It's also not really that comedic, so...
Yeah, this isn't funny. Blackadder's
weird reference to make, George.
Yeah. It's like, by the way, isn't that hilarious? All those hands chopped off and poisonings and snakes and yeah. It's hilarious.
Reminds me of that comedy.
So did this escalate things, or was it just so escalated that it just, like, you can't escalate any more than things already were? I would say it probably did, because you can escalate things more, as we're going to see, because things do escalate more. Like, this is bad, but
maybe this didn't, but it did get escalated.
Yeah, maybe this, Nina says, well, it certainly didn't help de-escalate. Yes, that's clear. There was definitely anger in the Stormlands, probably anger at the Red Keep, and Orys Baratheon himself was permanently pissed. I mean, understandably, they crippled him. Like, that's a lot of his identity was wrapped up in his sword arm, and they took it. So
the prisoner exchange for money itself might have de-escalated things, but when you get the prisoners and their hands are removed, that's the thing that would, if anything, escalate.
Well, I mean, it wasn't a surprise to them when they got the prison. Like, they would have prepped. They would have told them before the transfer, right?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. They just found out when they got them?
It says it was revealed. Yeah, the way it's written, It sounds like they didn't know that was coming. Yeah. This might be a bit of a nod or an insult or a needling of the Stormlanders because of what Argilac did to Aegon's envoy when he was like, hey, marry my daughter, no, I'll marry, you can marry Orys himself, the man whose hand was cut off, right? And it's like, well, that's what you did. That's what the Stormlanders did to Aegon, so it's kind of like, yep, a little bit of, it's not payback, but it's, more of the same. So that's quite a thing. Yeah, and Orys became obsessed with revenge and quit as Hand. Like, he's basically not long after getting back, or maybe immediately. He may have already decided to quit when he was maimed, before he returned to King's Landing. He may have already decided to quit, or maybe he'd been pondering it or something like that. Either way, he was gone, out of the picture, at least for now. His career isn't over. We will be returning to him, but he is no longer a participant in the First Dornish War. Cutting the hands off reminds me of something else that happened under the democracy of Athens in the time of the Peloponnesian War, or just around that era. They defeated the island nation of Aegina, and the quote is, so that he might forever after be disabled from holding a spear, yet might handle an oar. They didn't cut their hands off, they cut their thumb off. Their thumbs off. You could still pull an oar, because Aegina was an island nation. that was sometimes under the auspices of Athens. They were sometimes like a subject. And at this point, they were at war, and so well, you can still do trade and have a living, but you're not going to fight us with that hand. So it was kind of a similar vibe. Something that really happened. I guess that would have been around the year like 430, 420 BC, something like that. The replacement for Lord Orys was Lord Edmund Tully. He's a new hand of the king. He's the Lord Paramount of the Trident, the same guy who was the first to turn on Harren the Black in favor of Aegon. So Aegon again rewards him for his service. Apparently it had been going well, and the man ascended to even higher honors. So yeah, whether the widow lover made things worse or not, Aegon's response was certainly also not like a de-escalation. It was just more and more. He went and burned everything the Wills owned that he could get his dragon flame on. But that was not super effective. Like, yes, he gave the Harrenhal treatment to their watchtowers and their castle and farms and fields and stuff, but they hid in their caves with their big piles of gold. How do you sleep at night? On top of a huge pile of money. I don't know about the surrounded by many beautiful ladies part, but maybe that part too. So, yeah, that's a pretty big deal. And so we're in the year 7 AC now. And there's an interesting factor to consider. As I said, Orys may have been the de facto heir. There's no indication he would have ever superseded a dragon rider, but now we have a son born to Rhaenys and Aegon, and we're not sure when this child was born. The child could have easily been born after the ransom, but the pregnancy, we got 9 months of pregnancy, that gets noticed at some point. So she was probably pregnant before the ransom was finished, which is an interesting spot to be in. They know a kid's coming. They don't know the gender, but it's an heir. Even if it's a girl, it's an heir because it's a child of the princess or the queens and the king, or one queen and the king. So we always have to consider that when a child is born. Don't forget that there would have been months of a child's coming. We know a child is coming. There's a pregnancy. This is happening. Rhaenys was probably flying Meraxes and burning castles while she was pregnant, which a little extra risk, but maybe not a whole lot extra risk. More than she might have thought, though, given what happens in a few years. So, but there was negativity about this kid. And you wonder if, Dornish agents were maybe pushing this angle a little bit, start a little turmoil, cause a little rumor in the royal household. That could be to their benefit, to cause a little rift, or to maybe any sort of scandal in the royal family might affect the war in a positive way for Dorne. The rumor being that Aenys was maybe not Aegon's. Rhaenys was noted to surround herself with young, handsome men, and Aenys was weak and sickly and shy, which isn't much of a piece of evidence, but Aegon being so manly and strong that people took that as evidence, or quote-unquote evidence. I'm using the finger quotes right now when I say evidence. Regardless of the truth, the rumors were real. Those really happened, and that mattered. Apparently, it didn't go too far, and the tide started to turn as far as Aenys's strength, his boldness of character, because the dragon Quicksilver was hatched, or maybe around this time. I'm guessing a little before, maybe in the year 6 or even 5, but still referred to as a hatchling, so probably still pretty darn young. I don't know when a dragon ceases to be a hatchling. I'm not sure what the timeline on dragon growth is. Like a kitten, apparently a cat is no longer a kitten after 1 year. I don't know what that... I don't know that for pretty much any other species, even dogs.
Our cats, on the other hand, are still kittens to this day.
Yes, 11 years later, 10 years later, they are kittens. It's right. That's right.
Well, kitten, you do call Koja kitten.
I do.
One of them is a kitten to Aziz.
Balerion is still a hatchling to Aegon. Oh, look at the cute little murder bomber. Look at the cute little nuclear bomber. It's tempting to see Quicksilver as the spawn of Meraxes, since Quicksilver is probably silver, given the name. We don't actually know for sure. It's a pretty safe guess. And Meraxes is silver with golden eyes. So, yeah, that's pretty cool.
We don't know what the timeline is for Aenys either, do we? We don't know, quite his age. I'm just thinking about the idea. It might be a hard rumor to battle for the 3-year-old. The 3-year-old is shy
Yeah.
and weak. Well, all 3-year-olds are weak. And how do you define shy at age 3? Like,
Yeah, some
so,
little babies are like, go towards the big animal, and some are just scared of everything. I don't know. There's some,
yeah.
but apparently that changed pretty quickly. Once Quicksilver bonded with Aenys and vice versa, Aenys apparently showed more baby versions of bravery, whatever that actually means, using Sean's point there. And that also, for some reason, since the rumors of paternity were somewhat wrapped up in his sickliness and weakness, once his sickliness and weakness started to pass, that also tampered down the rumors of his parentage, which I've always found these rumors a little fascinating, because there's also some rumors around Maegor and Visenya, but there's definitely nothing certain here. But it would be interesting to find out that Aegon the Conqueror was sterile and he never actually had any children, and that both of these heirs were not of his body. But they are Targaryen. They definitely came from Rhaenys and Visenya. There's no getting around that fact. It's like the Tyrion Targaryen theory. Like, no matter who his father is, his mom's Joanna. That's a Lannister.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
barring time travel,
yes, the Tyrion time traveling fetus theory aside, we can't forget such luminary ideas in our fandom. We'd be remiss to just dismiss that one out of hand. I mean, man, time traveling feti are a real thing. Is that how you say plural of fetus? Feti? I don't know.
It is now.
It is
That's
now.
how we say it.
Yes, feet. I'm going to find more opportunities to use that word, feti. Sounds kind of, it's very Roman. Yes, feti. So you notice that this bonding with Quicksilver came after hatching, which reminds us that the dragon egg in the cradle tradition was not a thing yet. That came later, which is one of the reasons we can be pretty sure it wasn't a thing in Valyria either, unless it was a rediscovered tradition, something was re-implemented. But it doesn't seem to be, because it looks like it began with Rhaena, as in firstborn of King Aenys and, well, Prince Aenys at the time, and Princess Alyssa. Eventually King Aenys and Queen Alyssa. So their firstborn was the one that apparently started this. And
Gay Rhaena.
What's that?
Gay Rhaena.
Gay Rhaena.
To be
Yes,
clear,
Gay
I just want to make it shorter for any of you who are like, wait, which
Rhaena.
Rhaena? Gay Rhaena.
Yeah, there's several Rhaenas. It is hard to keep track of. Not as many Rhaenas as there are Aegons, but there's less written about the Rhaenas, so we have to give them nicknames. They don't have numbers. Aegons all have numbers or nicknames. Yeah. And maybe this is why her own father became stronger thanks to bonding with his dragon. Right? Like, if the closeness, if maybe there's a little magic involved in there, the egg in the cradle might start that process earlier. If it's magical, then who knows what's happening. An even more obvious association with eggs in cradles is Daenerys. Like, it wasn't her cradle, but those eggs were like speaking to her. She was like bonding with them in her dream. Talk about getting stronger. Those eggs were a crucial item, a focal point for her growing into the character that she became later. The hatching was a big leap forward in that, because it proved a lot that was going on in her head was actually quite real. But she got strength from those eggs. She would, when she felt weak, she'd be like, I want to hold one of those eggs, And I feel like this is a pretty strong clue to maybe what was happening on maybe a smaller scale. Maybe the vibes were there. Maybe it wasn't intense. Maybe they weren't having these overwhelming dreams every night like Dany was, but they might have been having, a little something in there at night, some feelings, some visions, but milder types, Regardless of that, going forward, things had changed without any military objectives being achieved by either side, right? We've got the royal house having at least one new dragon, but probably more. That's not mentioned, but dragons are hatching. Quicksilver wasn't the only one to hatch. There's the cannibal might exist by now. Vermithor might have hatched by now. Some of these other dragons, that matters. That's just, even as there aren't a lot of Targaryen children, there's more Targaryen dragons hatching, which for whatever reason had been at an ebb. For some reason there weren't as many dragons, but now the royal house's hatchery more is going on. We don't know why. Maybe that's another topic for another day, but that just shows the growing strength of this new Iron Throne. More dragons these dragons will be ridden. You know, if not by Aenys, then by more children that are coming. And that perhaps makes him a target. We haven't gotten to the stage of the war when the assassinations become common, but we're about to in the second half. And you got to think, if you're willing to chop hands off, if you're willing to kill anyone that's coming for you, you're probably willing to kill the ones who will be doing that to you 30 years in the future, which is what will happen if you allow Aenys to become an adult. Or from their perspective, that's actually not how Aenys is going to operate, but they have no reason to believe otherwise.
You know, something else just occurred to me. We haven't thought about this in a while, but this sort of new revelation that we have about this prophecy that Aegon knew about, that maybe that's part of why he didn't make adjustments in Dorne. He just knew they were going to win. He may have had some, misinterpreted vision, but some vision that Dorne would be part of the Seven Kingdoms. And that he might have thought that he was going to do it, and that what he was doing was working because he had this vision. He didn't realize how long it was going to be. The dragons wouldn't be involved, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Factor meals. Factor's delicious. Wait. Oh. Okay. Factor meals. Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals make eating chef-crafted meals. Yes. Factor meals. Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals make eating chef-crafted meals better every day. Very easy. In 2 minutes, you can have your food prepared. You can fuel up fast with restaurant-quality meals, much healthier than fast food, and actually cheaper and actually faster. Faster than fast food and healthier. What can be better than that? There's no prepping, cooking, or cleanup needed. And it isn't just a batch of dinners. You got snacks, you got smoothies, you got breakfast food, you've got midday meals, you've got options, and you customize it based on your eating habits. You aren't fitting yourself to a meal plan. The meal plan is fitting itself to you. It's meant to work around your schedule. That's really what Factor's goal is. And so you can get as much or as little as you need, as low as 6 meals per week, as high as 18 meals per week. You can very easily pause or reschedule deliveries. The name of the game is flexibility. The name of the game is speed, but also health. We're not sacrificing any nutrition by making things faster and quicker and more efficient. Head to factormeals.com/Westeros50 and use the code Westeros50 to get 50% off. That's code Westeros50, factormeals.com/Westeros50 to get 50% off. Get started today. Eat healthier, save money. It's all great. Dornish Dame says, we also think of the Wars of the Roses taking place from 1455 to 1485, but there were long periods in that time without any battles and one side or the other plotting in exile. Perfect example. Very perfect example. Yeah, it wasn't 30 years of armies and battles and sieges. There were long periods of other things, like he says, whether it's plotting in exile, whether it's recouping your strength or petitioning other kings around Europe to take up their cause. These things take time, travel, etc. I mean, just getting from place to place is slower in those times than it is now. They're not having phone calls. They got to send letters back and forth. Just that takes months, just everything is slower, and they can't be active in winter, etc., etc. Yeah, lots of things like that. Dornish Dame also says Quicksilver's role in making Aenys appear stronger has an interesting parallel in Bran apparently getting stronger during his coma when he could hear the wolves sing. That's a very good catch. I like that. Yeah, a lot of these sort of animal bonding with supernatural elements are written similarly to enjoy, at least in that regard. Like, we have no indication that there's a communication bond between dragons and riders other than maybe some emotional flashes here back and forth, like maybe the same kind of things that a dog can interpret from their owner. Not like a skin changer where they're like seeing through each other's eyes. That's definitely a different level. But there are similarities. And this whole getting stronger thing, that's a good catch, because yeah, Bran was getting stronger, notably when he could hear the wolves singing, and that may be magical. It may just be like very human. Just the sound of the wolves is like brings him back to who he is. It helps draw him out of his coma and brings him back to the real world. For example, I don't know if this anecdote is true, but I just happened to see it this morning. The guy who was the original voice of Bugs Bunny once slipped into a coma, and the doctor actually got him out of the coma in part by saying, "What's up, Doc?" to him, and he would lapse into his Bugs Bunny voice in a coma, and that helped bring him out of it. The brain is weird, y'all, and we don't understand it very well. So that stuff applies even to fictional brains if you have a author who writes authentically, and George does in most ways. Austin Flowers also writes 160 pounds of gold is $4 million in today's market. That's a lot of money, but I don't know if we should go by today's market. It's a good way to find our bearings. But
I think it's more than that. Someone can do the math, but I think an ounce of gold right now is like $2,000, which means a pound of gold is $30,000, and 30,000 times 106. I don't know if I'm doing that math right, but I think it's like $1 billion. I think it's like $1 billion.
Anyway, well, it's a lot of money, and the value of gold is different in Westeros anyway. But yeah, it's a huge amount. So, and that's not one of George's strengths is consistency with currency value. So we would probably not get to a super strong answer if we went any deeper, and I'm not sure we could. Anyway, let's move to the year 8 AC. We're told 8 AC was a very dry season, very dry year, and that aligns with what we've been saying about the winters, because, in case you didn't know, the driest season is winter. Winter is dry. Drier in Dorne. Ooh, that's bad. It's bad to be drier in Dorne. But the enemy armies weren't there. The Dornish kind of know how to handle that, I guess. And it wasn't just like that in Dorne. Quote.
In 8 AC, a very dry year, Dornish raiders crossed the Sea of Dorne on ships provided by a pirate king from the Stepstones, attacking half a dozen towns and villages along the south shore of Cape Wrath, and setting fires that spread through half the Rainwood. Fire for fire, Princess Miria is reported to have said. This was not something the Targaryens would allow to go unanswered.
Kind of a ridiculous thing to say, right? Like that last sentence. It's like, unanswered? This is like year 4 of this war now, or year 3? Like, you're attacking each other. I mean, that's what you do in a war, unanswered. I mean, yeah, we'll just let that one go. Well, of course, like, you're already in a war. I mean...
Like, this was an answer to something the Targaryens did in the first place.
Yeah.
Second of all, are there some other things that they did let go unanswered?
Yeah.
Like,
what exactly is the question here? If this needs to go unanswered, like, what is the question here?
I guess this is being written, I don't know, from the perspective of the Targaryens.
It's very pro-Targaryen,
you know? Yeah, so...
But, and it's, so I say it's silly, but it's also authentic. Like, this is often how history is written. It's like, well, of course the Targaryens would have an answer to that. Well, yeah. They started it. I mean, I just think it's funny to act like provocations even really matter at this point. Like, oh, you provoked us. Like, what? I don't think so. I think the provocations, we're past the provocations point here. We're well into it, you know?
You know, I wonder, again, it's something we don't quite know, but maybe this is something that happened after an extended truce, right?
Okay,
maybe enough time had passed without something significant happening that this is like, all right, that's over. We're back at it, you know?
Yeah, and it is an escalation in the sense that, oh, you're gonna blow up and torch all our villages and castles and fields, well, we can do that to you too. That's kind of why I call this episode Dorne Strikes Back, because they accomplished quite a bit considering how much devastation they faced. They are able to attack Westeros, they're able to assassinate people, and they're able to not give up.
I thought you were going to talk about all the backs they were hitting.
They strike so many backs.
I've been waiting for that to come up.
Yeah, Sir Mix-a-Lot got back and they strike it. You know, they brought Sir Mix-a-Lot into this war and Darth Vader and yeah. This war's getting. I told y'all this war gets crazy. We got Darth Vader and Sir Mix-a-Lot.
I wanted to bring up something about the weather, about winter.
Yeah.
You know, and how it would affect water, among other things. Even if it wasn't like a freezing cold winter in Dorne, but one effect, you know, because sometimes you only need a few degrees to change to get above or below freezing temperatures, right?
Yeah.
And maybe in the middle of the 90-degree Dornish desert, it doesn't matter. But here in Denver and a lot of the West, the water comes from snowmelt in the mountains that flows down rivers into reservoirs and such. And so if in the mountains it stays winter enough for the snow to not melt, that means water's drying up everywhere else.
Which is why it's dry. Yeah, you're right. That's part of why it makes it dry. It's not that the water isn't there. It's that it's frozen a lot. Well, in some cases. That makes a lot of sense.
And so it's probably still miserably hot in the desert, but there's less water in the wells or in the streams that there would be from the melting in the mountains. And so you're still kind of getting hit by the heat of the desert, but the effects of the weather.
Yeah.
And something, again, the Dornish would be much more aware and prepared for than any kind of attempted invading armies.
Which is why they probably felt reasonably confident that armies might not march on them again. They were probably also confident that the dragons would return, and they'd be right about that. I mean, obviously, Valerian had already returned to torch the Wills lands after the cutting off of the hands, but they all surely knew more dragons were coming as long as this war continued. And the big change here too is Aegon is no longer the guy who can claim to just be taking on leaders and sort of the peasantry are mostly being left alone. This war has escalated to the point where lots of villages are getting burned. And now we've got villages in his portion of the kingdom getting burned too as retaliation. So lots of just completely innocent people getting killed. People who aren't combatants. Like, you could argue that certain people forced to fight in the army shouldn't have been. But these people aren't even lifting a spear. These are just completely innocent individuals and people who probably already hate Dornishmen because they've been raided and their families have been raided by the Dornish in the past. But also it's Pirate King. These ships came from some Pirate King. This is a very underrated little aspect here. Like, the Dornish have got allies, and they're not explicitly mentioned as such, but a Pirate King from the Stepstones. We've all heard about Pirate Kings from the Steps. This has happened a lot of different times. Where did the money come from? Well, my theory is pretty straightforward. It came from those ransoms, right?
Yeah.
Like, they got a big pile of money, and they surely have other money too, but that is a very big obvious potential source for that cash.
That's another thing I wonder about the details and the story behind. Were they asking for that ransom because they knew they needed the money to hire pirates? Or once they got the ransom, they're like, "Ooh, now we can hire pirates." Or maybe the pirates are like, "Hey, those Dornish just got a big ransom. Maybe we can go offer our services." Like, what?
I like that last idea.
What,
like, they're flush now. It will help. And the target. And like, if you're a pirate king, you're anti-Targaryen probably. You don't like dragons. You don't want them coming for you either. You're the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of situation. The Century of Blood, let's not forget Century of Blood isn't that far in the past at this point. And it's not like there's some arbitrary end to the Century of Blood. Like, oh, it's been 100 years. Well, that's a century. It's over now. Now it's the Century of Water. I don't know. Century of Fire. Blood and fire. There you go. So
yeah, that's another thing that would have taken perspective of time to look back and realize, oh, that was 100 years of terribleness.
Yeah.
Or whether it was 98 years or 107 years, it'll just be called a century as more time passes.
Yeah, and because there's no definitive beginning in it, well, there is a definitive beginning of Doom, but there's no definitive ending. And the point being, the effects of the Doom, even 100 years later, are still being felt. There's still burgeoning kingdoms. The power vacuum is still being filled. It was a big, big, big power vacuum to fill the fall of Valyria, and it happened so suddenly. So lots of leaders and governments are still establishing themselves even 100 years later. There's all this turmoil and tumult and chaos that takes a while to... That's why it was a whole century. So yeah, everything isn't just all nice and clean and organized now. So lots of people probably didn't like this new situation of the Iron Throne. Like, these Targaryens, like, we just got done with dragon lords. And now there's a whole new royal family on a much larger landmass? Like, look ahead. Think ahead if you're an SOC person. You're like, what's that going to look like in 40 years? Are there going to be 20 Well, yeah, that is kind of what happened. There's going to be, maybe it took a little longer than that, but that is eventually what it looked like. A very powerful royal family with a ton of dragons that could theoretically be a threat to people in Essos, especially the free cities. The ones who were ruled by Valyria before, they know what that's all about. The Volantines tried to conquer them right during the Century of Blood. And the Volantines didn't have dragons. And part of the reason the Volantines lost was Aegon attacked them. So they're like, yeah, all these things are like kind of scary. Like, we don't want to. So you can see why a pirate king or several would want to help the Dornish in this struggle. Like, yeah, we don't want the Targaryens to get more powerful. We don't want them having all of Westeros. We don't want them coming for us either, but better to help our enemies deal with them rather than face them, head on ourselves. So yeah, this raiding, it would have been really brutal. It would have been really nasty, setting fires. There would have been all sorts of assaults and depravities and atrocities. And in some ways, it would have been worse than just straight up dragon fire, because you don't have when people are involved in raids, you have things like sexual assault and much more like personal levels of violence. So if you can hide from the dragon flame, you'll make it. But it's when there's like 100 dudes running around trying to grab you and do awful things. That's a different sort of horror. I think I'd rather face the dragon. Actually, I'd definitely rather face the dragon. If I was a woman, it wouldn't even be close.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, and we were talking about how it's so horrible what's coming up, and like, well, what happened already was horrible too.
Yeah.
But it is a little bit more, I don't know, easier to swallow when a bunch of people in the army get killed.
Yeah.
Right? Because, well, they're in the army. What do you think was going to happen? Now, maybe they didn't have a choice about being in the army. It's still sad, the families that were left behind and everything. But as you said, that now we're targeting just innocent people who didn't have anything to do with this choice to go to war, don't have any control over or resources for their defenses or ability to affect it. They're just going about their lives and suddenly being attacked and raped and murdered and terrorized.
It's not even a military target. Like, this doesn't help the war at all. It only makes people madder. It only is like, we got them. Makes them feel better about, like, we got one. We did something to them after what they did to us. It's not military help. It doesn't do any good in terms of the war. So, like, as much as I tend to side with Dorne because they're the ones being invaded. This is not good. This is not justified. Nina wonders if one of these mini towns that was destroyed or raided, was the Weeping Town. The Weeping Town becomes famous when Daeron I is assassinated and his body lies in state there for a few days and then acquires that name. But it didn't have a name at the time. It probably did to the locals, but not a name that would show up on maps or anything. Very rare is a place like that become famous, and it did for a very specific reason, 150-ish years later. And this idea of pirate kings, if this pirate king is just casually mentioned as helping the Dornish, well, what other allies did they have? Did they get maybe some secret aid? Like maybe the Volantines or the Lyseni sent them some gold on the sly. Like, we can't send you any soldiers. We don't want the Targaryens to know, but we do want y'all to win. So we'll send you secret supply. We'll send you some shipments or whatever. But even that eventually would be difficult to do because, where are those boats going to land? How do you ship goods to rebels hiding in deep desert caves? Like, how do you supply them that assistance in the first place? So this is one of the logistical issues with being a guerrilla force is even your allies don't know where you are to give you stuff. It's like, yikes. Like, you're so well hidden that even your friends don't know where you are. So, and of course, the Pirates of the Stepstones at this point, who knows how powerful they were? They might have been quite powerful. It's not something mentioned a lot. They weren't a big part of what was going on in Westeros because, well, they don't want to mess with the dragons. They don't want to, ships, as we've said many times, ships don't do so well. Ships are even more vulnerable than people when it comes to dragons. So this was the start, though. This counter invasion of sorts, even though it was mostly a raid, it is escalated the following year. Let's go to the year 9 AC, another big year, very eventful. Dornish counter invasions take a new form. Rather than raiding, we got full-blown armies. Lord Fowler leads an army out of Skyreach and takes Nightsong. Sir Joffrey Dane, leads an army through secret passes in the Red Mountains to emerge near Old Town and starts ravaging the territory there. Sean, does this tell you that it's no longer winter? I think it might.
Possibly. Yeah, I guess it might. The fact that they've gotten the resources together to mobilize an army and attack with it, that a harvest may have come.
Yeah.
Now, still, I want to say not necessarily, because that was a lot of money for that ransom. That might have given enough money to just buy food from elsewhere to maybe even hire mercenaries or buy whatever equipment and ships and everything else. So
we don't know that the will would have shared that windfall with his fellow lords, but it would make sense for him to do that if it would make such a difference in the war. Like, what good is a pile of gold to the war effort? You need to be spending that,
Yeah.
Like, he's not.
You can't feed your people gold.
Yeah.
You can't equip your soldiers with gold.
He can't go out and use it. He's not gonna go partying. Like, he's a wanted
Yeah.
man, basically. Not that he even is interested in that necessarily, but so yeah, that's money for the war. And yeah, it's entirely possible he spread it around. It's entirely possible he funded some of these other efforts, or helped at least.
Especially given the nature of the Dornish, what's the word I'm looking for? Camaraderie. They're all in this together.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't seem like any peoples or regions are like, we're out, this is too much. They all keep being on board. So.
Yes. Now, the Lord Edmund Tully, we said he had become hand in AC7 after the resignation of Lord Orys. Well, he didn't last very long. His wife died in childbirth, and he resigned his position. Now, I wonder, reading between the lines here, was this an excuse? Was he just like, the war is escalating, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. Atrocities are being committed. This is no longer an honorable situation. But he doesn't want to say that to the king's face. So he's just like, my wife died, I gotta go. Of course it's entirely possible that his wife's death legitimately shattered him. That's entirely possible. That's entirely possible. And of course, obviously, her life is the one that was truly shattered by her death. But he may have truly, like, you never know with these political marriages. Like, were they actually in love? Who knows? We don't know much about Edmund. We don't even know Lady Tully's name. So who knows which is true, but it would be a very good excuse if he wanted to leave. If he wanted to bail on his position because of the way things were going, is a very good excuse. All the assassinations that started happening it's gonna start to pick up soon, if it maybe already did. He might not want to be in that particular crosshair. He's like, yeah, I'm a target. I'm the hand of the king. Look what happened to the last one. I don't want to be around for that. But this is the man who turned on Harren the Black. That was pretty brave. So I'm not sure we can pin him as someone that's going to run away at the barest threat of assassination. So there's a lot of unknowns here, which is goes to show there's a lot of interesting possibilities here. This character, if he was ever fleshed out more, well, these are the kind of decisions that George or whatever writers would have to make. And they've got a lot to work with.
And again, there might be a parallel to Ned Stark. Like, maybe he's brave enough to face assassination, but he might realize his family's in danger, right? His loved ones might get assassinated. Like, I'm out.
Yeah. So that's a pretty big deal. Now, another possibility is we have to keep in mind here is the timing. A lot of times we were told several things happen in this year, but we don't know in what order they happen. And that really, really matters. For example, when was Aenys born? If Aenys was born before the ransom of Lord Orys or after, it might affect how much they were willing to pay, right? If they knew they had a boy, they're like, all right, well, we don't pay quite as much, or or if the kid is, they had less negotiating leverage. Well, we don't need Orys anymore. We got this Prince Aenys now. Like, that takes 20% off the top right there, But if he hadn't been born yet, who knows,
And it does seem like a cold calculation. But the fact is, someone's got to make that calculation. Like, someone has to decide, how much do we have? How much can we afford? What value do we get from them? Some people maybe are purely working off emotion, but someone on there is crunching some numbers.
That's what actuaries do, right? They put the value. Like, someone's got to calculate what life insurance is worth. Someone's got to calculate like how much these premiums cost, and that math has to be crunched by somebody. Yeah, a similar kind of thing here in a much different auspices, much different scenario, but you're still calculating the value of a life, which is awkward to say the least, but has to be done sometimes. And and there's also the factor of what I was building up to, rather, is the death of Rhaenys. If Lord Tully resigned before the death of Rhaenys, that's one thing, but if he resigned after, well, then that's very telling, because he's like, oh boy, I can tell this is going to get so much worse. The escalations are going to escalate. Even the worst escalations will be escalated upon once that happens. So that's where I think the big unknown is. What happened first? Let's discuss. The following year was perhaps marked by the most significant deaths of the war, and though we're not sure what part of the year it happened in, it's so important that we'll start with it. So I think this happened after Lord Tully's resignation, because it seems to be that happened in year 9, and this happened in the year 10, but these things are all kind of loose. And of course, I'm referring to what happened over the deep sands, the death of Rhaenys. Quote,
"The Targaryen dragons bred and trained to battle, had flown through storms of spears and arrows on many occasions and suffered little harm. The scales of a full-grown dragon were harder than steel, and even those arrows that struck home seldom penetrated enough to do more than enrage the great beasts. But as Meraxes banked above the Hellholt, a defender atop the castle's highest tower triggered a scorpion, and a yard-long iron bolt caught the queen's dragon in the right eye. Meraxes did not die at once, but came crashing to earth in mortal agony, destroying the tower and a large section of the Hellholt's curtain wall in her death throes. Whether Rhaenys Targaryen outlived her dragon remains a matter of dispute.
We will discuss whether or not she lived in the next episode when we're discussing the piece and the letter, because those things all very much wrap together. But just imagine, this is one of those moments like we had last episode where I really want to try to imagine what it was like, as uncomfortable as it is, because it's like so violent, but it's also just so epic and crazy. I want to put yourself in both Rhaenys' place, where you're just super confident this has never not worked, and all of a sudden, oh my god. And it's just over in a few seconds, probably, unless she lived, which, again, we'll discuss that later. As for the defenders, though, like, which person... And it might have been a woman. I say person because at this stage of the war, like, first of all, if you're talking about soldiers in Westeros, yeah, it's usually a safe assumption that it's a man. But in Dorne, you can't be as sure. And in a war that's lasted this long, you can be even less sure. Like, the more men are killed in war, the more women are pressed into battle. Like, look at Bear Island. The women are like, it's a normal thing for them to fight there because it's such a normal thing for them to have to fight. They're pressed into combat because the need is that great, right? I could totally assume that here. Especially for something that maybe doesn't require great strength. Like, you got a lever. You're pulling a lever on the scorpion bolt. That doesn't necessarily require some massive upper body strength. All it requires is that you're not, like, gonna panic. And if you're, plenty of people can handle that. Plenty of women can handle that, right? And we don't know who this person was. Maybe that's a good thing for them because they would have been targeted for retaliation. Maybe they died in the crash of the dragon. Maybe, like, the wall, maybe the dragon hit near where the bolt came from, and the person was killed in the fall. So we have no idea who this person was. This person is probably semi-legendary, but anonymous perhaps to save their life.
And their family's lives, the way this is going.
Good point, yeah. So yeah, definitely guilt by association is a thing. Guilt in quotes here. So it's a huge deal. It isn't just the death of Meraxes, who is a powerful weapon for the Targaryen. It isn't just the death of Rhaenys, who's one of the queens and the mother of the only heir right now. This shoots down, literally, the notion that these dragons are invincible, that they're invulnerable. Dorne, again, embarrassed of the rest of the Seven Kingdoms doing something, succeeding in something where all else had failed. They didn't even come close to stopping the dragons in the earlier part of the conquest. But now we have not just stopping one, killing one, taking out their rider, dead or not, she's at least captured. So that's a huge deal. Like, again, I use Greek history as an example. The Spartans and their unbeatable infantry. No one could beat, everyone was afraid of them because it had been like 100 years since they had been beaten in a land battle. And when they finally were beaten in a land battle, it was like everyone realized that, oh, the mystique was gone. It's like, oh, actually they can be beaten. Similar thing here. It's like, actually, the dragons can be beaten. It just goes to show we held out. We were brave. We didn't give up. We got to win. We got a big win. It's just a massive blow to the Targaryens because they think, oh, eventually we're going to wear them down. Doesn't look like it now, does it? Like, well, maybe they're going to wear you down, right? If they can take out a dragon.
Not only are you less able to wear them down because you have one less dragon, but now their morale is improved. And your morale is hurt on so many levels, yeah.
And now it becomes personal too, right? Which it already should have been. It was already personal in the first place to so many people, but now it's personal to the Targaryens.
I was going to say too, on that note, thinking about the idea of women being pressed into battle, some of them might have wanted to get into battle to avenge their husbands and their sons and everyone that had been killed.
Would have been ready for it, yeah. Yeah, maybe the person that shot down Meraxes was one such person. It's a guarantee that the person who shot down Meraxes knew people had lost friends and family in the war. Like, how could they not? Like, the whole country was years into this conflict, and the dragons had come several times. So, really interesting, really big, really huge moment. A big win for the Dornish, and Nina wonders whether they left the wall kind of half destroyed as a monument to that. The bones are still there. The sun-bleached bones of Meraxes are still there. That, talk about a symbol. The skull isn't. The skull will be returned, and we know that. Like, we see the skull in the basement.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised no one ever like came in and like, let me just take a little bit of this bone and make myself a weapon. Like, I'm surprised it hasn't been harvested.
Maybe a
all.
little bit of that has
maybe
happened,
a little bit.
You know, maybe like a few
but people might
vertebra
just be
here and there.
People might be like respectful, honorable, and not know that they'll be sorely punished if they're caught or something like that.
Like
but I could also see an Uller or someone at the Hellhole be like, this is
the
my
Lord
right.
himself.
I am the Lord. I want a cool weapon.
Yeah.
Let's do that. Like, I could see that.
I totally agree. I headcanon now. The Lord Uller has the hilt of his sword is made from dragon bone.
Yeah, I'm like, just say, why would you not do that? I don't know. Like, I can't imagine having that much. Like, that's a huge skeleton. That's a lot.
Gigantic. Yeah, Meraxes was huge.
I could think of one potential why you might not. It might get associated with some sort of curse or something like that.
Maybe.
Yeah, no, that's true.
But I still think it would take time for that curse to come about. So at first, I can imagine scavengers of those in power did get some pieces of it for a trophy or a tool or whatever. But I can imagine eventually they realize, wait a minute, cut this out. We want this to stand as a monument.
Yeah.
I could see that, which is what Nina was getting at with maybe leaving the wall in a place or just building a new wall around it and just leaving the destroyed section and still having it closed off elsewhere. Like,
do you think there's a difference in any of the parts of the bone of a dragon in terms of efficacy?
Maybe, like, I don't know how you like turn a giant rib cage bone into a handle. You know, like that's just such a huge thing. You know, like I could see the rib cage still being there, but maybe like bits of the tail or little finger bone, little claw, little digits of little knuckles, things like that could be used. I don't know. Yeah. I know very little about bones.
Carved like stone or something. I bet one rib could be many handles.
Yeah. If you could somehow break it apart, you know, with Valyrian steel, diamond chisel away those bones. Yeah. Yep. So the next section here in our episode is called The Dragon's Wrath, and it begins with a quote.
The next 2 years were the years of the Dragon's Wrath.
Oh, yeah.
I'll say it again, please. The next 2 years were the years of the Dragon's Wrath. Every castle in Dorne was burned thrice over, as Balerion and Vhagar returned time and time again. The sands around the Hellhold were fused into glass in places, so hot was Balerion's fiery breath. The Dornish lords were forced into hiding, but even that did not buy them safety. Lord Fowler, Lord Vaith, Lady Tolland, and 4 successive lords of the Hellhold were murdered, one after the other, for the Iron Throne had offered a lord's ransom in gold for the head of any Dornish lord. Only 2 of the killers lived to collect their rewards, however, and the Dornish men took their reprisals, repaying blood with blood. Lord Connington of Griffin's Roost was killed whilst hunting, Lord Mertens of Mistwood poisoned with his whole household by a cask of Dornish wine, Lord Fell smothered in a brothel in King's Landing. Smothered by what?
A pillow? I don't know.
No.
He got really drunk and then they...
No, I like to think it's more pleasant.
Yeah, he was smothered by boobies. Yes. For episode after episode, I've been hammering away at the way Aegon presents himself, like his persona, his like, I dominate. I meet you head on, I win. There's no doubt who's stronger. Straightforward victories is the name of the game for him. No question about cleverness, no cunning, just who's the strongest without leaving doubt. But here, that's gone. Like, burning castles for no purpose is one thing that was a bit of an escalation, but now you're just out here murdering people. Assassinations, this is completely different. This is not the Aegon that arguably did a good thing by uniting the Seven Kingdoms. That man killed a lot of people, but you could at least argue that he prevented a lot of death in the future because constant war was a thing between all these kingdoms. He stopped King Harren. He stopped some of these other guys who would constantly fight each other. Although it's ethically questionable to start wars to save lives in the future, you can make that argument here that he saved lives in the long run. You cannot make that argument about how he handled Dorne. This is just evil, I think. I don't think you can say good things about this. He's not doing it. It's really hard to make the greater good argument here. The argument does exist, even if it's a little sketchy for the rest of the Seven Kingdoms, and even if you throw in the prophecy of saving the Seven Kingdoms from the others in the future, I don't think you still can't really justify that.
It's a pretty cool, sick move as a revenge, though. Like, as far as these things go, like your love, your wife, and her dragon are killed or kept held hostage, whatever.
Yeah.
But regardless, you're big mad, and you want to show your wrath. It's effective to just be like, I have lots of money. This is what you get when I'm actually mad at you. What you faced before was me trying to just like bring you into the realm. I don't know. Like, I agree with you. It's evil and all that, but like he was mad. He's really
like,
mad.
oh, I was holding back before. He's like, this is what I can now. I'll show you what I'm really capable of. Yeah.
Yeah. It speaks to
personal.
how much he cared that both about Rhaenys herself and I'm sure about Meraxes, about the dragon, their power, the humiliation aspect. Yeah.
He loved her. Like, you're right. Like, he loved Rhaenys. It seems pretty clear. Like, as much as it's hard to maybe understand what love means to a person like that, but he
loved her. That was his sister and his wife.
Yeah.
I mean, like, he knew her since they're like.
That part's hard to understand too.
Yeah, it's hard to understand, but he's known her his entire life.
Yeah. Yeah. He's like a year and a half older than her, 2 years older than her. They were a very tight knit group, and he obviously favored her over Visenya, personality wise and in bed wise, which those are probably very related.
Think about how depressed the other dragons are too, probably by this loss, like keening or whatever for Meraxes, upset. Yeah, and probably if we're right that dragons' emotions and the emotions of the Targaryens feed back and forth.
Yeah, Balerion would have been ornery.
Yeah, and it would have made Aegon more ornery, vice versa. They would have had like a vicious,
trickle down effect at court. Yeah, no, don't get on. Don't get on his bad side today or the next year or two. Aegon's really mad today.
Like we want to understand or justify this, but in the end, he's just going through what thousands and thousands of other people went through too.
Yeah.
They just don't have his privilege.
Yeah.
They just don't have the ability to exact this revenge.
They would have,
very
though.
well
They would have.
Yeah,
a lot of
maybe.
them would
Yeah,
have. Not
maybe.
all of them. Lots of them would have been like, stop.
Yeah.
Lots of them would have taken the Ilaria Sand route of it all. And like, where does this stop? Where does this end?
Yeah.
Like, it ends with me.
This is at the heart of why real world governments don't want their citizens owning massive weapons of destruction, because just any random person could get really mad and just yeah cause massive devastation. Yeah.
So just a little bit of devastation, which also sucks, but at least is manageable.
Yeah, just imagine if everyone had a dragon and
I mean, you can cause a lot of damage with your knife if you go
or
out
your
with
car.
or your car. I mean,
Yeah.
you can go out with a car and you can cause a lot of damage, but you could cause more if you had a plane and you flew it in.
Even a little prop plane can do a lot of damage. It's true. So we have already
And some of those things we mentioned too, though, at least they have all these other values, right? Like I can't tell you how much I dream of a world where the dragons get used to like haul equipment and transport people back and forth, just used for productive, innovative things instead of just weapons of war. You know? Anyway.
Oh well.
I would actually love it if anyone knows any fantasy series, books, or games, or
where that's a thing.
Yeah, I would like to know about dragons as like long haulers, as like I would like to, I'm sure that it exists in some franchise, so please let us know.
Clearing paths for roads.
Yeah, doing like productive being used for
heating up
industrial
furnace
work.
that can
Can you just picture a dragon with a hard hat and some coveralls?
Caution, dragon.
Dragon.
Catcalling the women that walk by.
Dragon calling.
Dragon calling.
Yeah.
Yes. A lord. So we've already established earlier in this episode that a lord's ransom in gold is a pretty huge amount. If it's weight based or not, it's a lot of money, right? 4 lords of the Hellholt, the site of Rhaenys' death. That's crazy, right? 4 in a row were murdered. And what were the payoffs for this? What were the ransoms for these what were the bounties on these lords? Like, well, this much for a Fowler, this much for a Martell, even more for for an Uller, because that's the house that killed Rhaenys. So that's why 4 in a row. I kind of suspect the rate was higher for Ullers, because 4 in a row were killed. Like, that's wild. Like, how do they keep getting them? Like, where's your guards, man? Do you have, like, I guess the money was just that tempting? Or were these non-Dornish people that somehow snuck in there and were able to pull this off? Or were these Dornishmen turning against their own for this huge amounts of money that they were being given? I mean, you can't always tell who's Dornish and who isn't, but you often can. So this is where I wonder, like, appearances and where they're like, did racism and prejudice start? Because we're like, we can't trust anyone who's not Dornish, or maybe we can't even trust other Dornish. 4 lords of the Hellhold in succession murdered. Like, we're not talking about a very long period of time here. This is like within a year or 2 or 3, I guess. 4 at most. That's crazy, right?
Another thought in this realm is that once Aegon is maybe making it personal and assassinating people, or whatever, like, what do you think individual lords might do?
That's making it personal too. Yeah, even more.
Yeah, like they might have also wanted to go assassinate somebody for revenge, but some code held them back. But now, well, the king's doing it. I'm doing like some of the assassinations might not have been Aegon. It might have just been individual lords of different castles or realms that have been attacked by the Dornish. Vice versa.
That's a great point, because that's what I was saying. It's like, well, Aegon was conducting himself honorably as a conqueror. None of this but now he's not. Arguably, well, easier to argue that he's not than he wasn't before. But yeah, the gloves are off kind of thing. Like, well, if he's not going to conduct himself honorably, then we're not either. Like, yeah, we have to sink to his level. And it worked. Like, there was murders on both sides. You see Lord Connington murdered while hunting. Like, I'm very curious to know about the circumstances. Lord Merton's, like, his whole household poisoned by a cask of Dornish wine. I bet that stopped trade of Dornish wine. People are like, I'm not touching that. No Dornish wine for a while. It was a while before anyone. A lot of people hiring food tasters and things like that. The anxiety, the paranoia that just anyone could murder you because the price on your head is so high. Like, how do you live like that? And this is going to be true for Stormlands lords, Reachman lords, and Dornish lords. Probably less so for the farther north you go, they're not so worried. Like Lannister lords, or Western lords, they're not worried. Northern lords are ignorant a lot of this is even happening. So,
a lot of this activity on both sides is what we would define today as terrorism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You're totally right. Yeah. And it's you can see why this is terrifying. Like, how do you live with
people are suddenly afraid to go out in the woods or eat their food or drink their drink.
In their own home.
Normal daily lifetime activities, even of relatively innocent people, are suddenly now in jeopardy. So.
Yeah.
Oh, can I just say, I really just want to, I don't want to wait to the end to bring up this comment from Dornish Dame. I wonder if there were any murders that were blamed on this conflict that actually had nothing to do with it.
Oh, yeah, someone's like, I just hate that guy. And I was like,
yeah, I just hated that guy.
Targaryens did that.
I love that idea.
Yeah, and that brings me to another point. Like, the Targaryens were offering these huge ransoms for, like, any Dornish lord, and maybe more for an Uller, maybe more for a Martell, I don't know. But were the Dornish assassins getting paid for their kills the same way? Like, did the Dornish lords put bounties on? Like, did they have as much money to offer? The Will might. But I don't know if they had the same level of cash. These might be more like loyalty murders rather than I'm getting paid. If the Dornish assassins were getting paid for their kills, I suspect it was less money, because I don't think Dorne had as much money to give, unless you're the Will.
It might have been water rations. Murders,
yeah. You kill this man.
Keep your goal. We just need water.
3 gallons of water. 3 gallons. Oh my god, that's so much. Never mind that they don't have gallons, but they surely have some unit of measure. And this mention of it's not in that. It is in the quote of how the sands around the Hellholt were fused into glass. That is perhaps a reference to the nuclear testing, which would be fresher on people's minds given the movie Oppenheimer, which I haven't myself seen, but I know that is the Trinity atomic bomb testing. There was glass in the sand after those superheats. So that tells you a bit how hot dragon fire is. It's up there. It can make the sands turn to glass. That's crazy to think about. Does anyone have dragon glass sand? Dragon glass? What do you call that? Dragon sand? Some Ullers might have cracked some pieces off and put little panes of glass in there.
Can you get the nuclear? Can you get the trinitite, that substance the sand became in the area about the like one?
This is nuclear glass.
Yeah. Can you get that one now? Two, could you get it at a certain point when it was not contaminated or something? Like maybe you couldn't get it 5 years later, but maybe now.
Yeah, is it radioactive? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if we can get trinitite, but that's what it's called.
I don't know the answer to that. That's very interesting. So, continuing, this is the year 10 AC. Each Dornish castle burned at least once by Vhagar or Balerion, except Sunspear. So this is another strategy they were going for. They were apparently trying to turn the Dornish against Sunspear to make to get people to believe that Sunspear had cut a side deal to avoid burning, while letting the rest of their countrymen take this suffering on them. It didn't work. Dornish didn't fall for that. They were too united. They were like, yeah, that's not. Maria didn't turn against us. It wasn't. I don't think this was a very good try. And the reason it's a rumor is because it's not proven. But Fire and Blood goes into detail about finding letters that seems to prove this. I'm like, it seems like it definitely happened. It just wasn't a very good plan.
There could have been another variable too. Maybe there were a lot of scorpions around Sunspear.
Okay.
Or
yeah.
So they maybe had better defenses of all sorts. It might have been like. Not only is there some strategic value to not attacking them that maybe it'll turn the rest of the country against them, but also they're more difficult to attack. They're farther away. They might have more defense and resources. So.
Yeah, and there was the mention last episode about the rumor that they had sent away to lease for some sort of anti-dragon gear, which ironically that happened at the Hellhold instead, and it wasn't any. It was just a scorpion bolt, which is already sort of a standard issue thing, which might have been. There might have been an uptick in need for those, given that's one of the few things that can hope to hurt a dragon.
I say, yes, you can definitely purchase trinitite.
You can. So
definitely
is it not radioactive?
Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's not radioactive, but it's very limited for obvious reasons.
Yeah, there's not a lot of it. Yeah,
there's ways
just
to
drop a few more nukes on the desert. There'll be plenty.
I mean, you can test it for authenticity and stuff using spectrographs, and I don't know. You buy very small samples. So yeah. Anyways, it's a risky thing to deal with, apparently.
Okay. All right. Well, the escalations continued to escalate. The retaliatory murders continued. They kept targeting lords of the Stormlands and the Reach, but they also aimed higher. Quote.
The king was attacked thrice, and would have fallen on 2 of those occasions but for his guards. Queen Visenya was set upon one night in King's Landing. 2 of her escorts were slain before Visenya herself cut down the last attacker with Dark Sister.
Remember that we're still early in King's Landing's development, and there's no Red Keep, so defense and security of the royals is not what it is now, which again is a point about Aenys, right? I would, if I were a dragon rider, sleep in a room with one door and my dragon sleeping in front of that door with it pressed against it, so there's no way in. Now that would be a problem if the dragon died in its sleep. I would be trapped in there, but still, that's what I would do if this was the state of affairs with assassins going everywhere. I'm not as brave as Aegon and Visenya and Rhaenys, though. So hey. And let's also check in with King's Landing and see that it's grown. Its rapid growth has continued. It's only 10 AC, and it's already as big as Gulltown or White Harbor. Technically, it's about 12 years old or 11 years old because, remember, it started to become a thing before the Second Coronation, which is what 10 AC refers to. But we're only adding an extra year and a half there. That's still like an astonishingly large place. In such a short period of time. Not unrealistic, but way faster than anyone probably expected it. And the problem there, and there's a lot of things we could say about the growth of King's Landing, but if we're sticking to the topic of assassinations, a big, new, ungoverned, unmanaged sprawl of a city that's like they're struggling to keep up with its growth. There's tons of places to hide and plan, like some hitmen or whatever. It'd be really easy for them to evade authorities and blend
Almost
in.
Everyone is new in town, so
yeah.
It's easier to find someone that can't be recognized or who's willing to do something or whatever.
That's a great point. Everyone's
I
new
do
in
want
town.
to say this is a minor tangent, but a couple of things I want to say. One is that the population will be even more explosive soon because people will start having kids. Like almost all the population there has come there from elsewhere, but now that population will create new generations.
Ooh, good
New
point.
people will still keep coming from other places. But the other thing is, certainly it was, less stable than most other cities. But I seem to remember way back thinking about the idea that Aegon, when he was traveling around before he even declared war or whatever, was probably learning about how to build a city. He's probably learning about infrastructure and such that cities would need, because he had this idea in his mind of creating what came to be King's Landing. I bet he had some groundwork set up, especially again because we know he brought in wards from all the other families. I bet there was a lot of planning ahead of time for this city's growth. It probably wasn't complete chaos, even though it wasn't completely stable either.
It wasn't planned. Like, it wasn't like a city that they're like, okay, streets are built on a grid. Yeah, it was just people just build stuff where they want to. Like, I'm going to build a house right here, and there's no zoning or anything like that.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I wonder if there was some zoning, if there was a grid.
There might have been
Aegon
something.
had done some research ahead of time.
The text kind of indicates
what would need to happen to build a city up.
The text kind of says no to that. Like, things just happen. Things just kind of appear. I mean, it's not super specific. There might have been some planning. Like, certain areas may have been designated. Well, no one can build here except the king. I'm sure things like that happen, but it sounds like a lot of it was pretty haphazard. Either way, it was a thing regardless. Like, lots of a fast-growing city that they probably didn't plan to grow this quickly, and yeah, lots of danger inherent to that, lots of management, lots of time needs to be spent like managing all that. A lot of that would have been on Visenya and the small council.
Even if it was well planned and orchestrated, they probably didn't account for the fact they would still be at war with Dorne.
Yes,
and Dorne would be assassinating people and poisoning people and all this other stuff.
Yeah. So Visenya also takes to sleeping in armor. She's sleeping in her armor, which is interesting because right around this time she's pregnant. A little bit harder to sleep in armor when you're pregnant. It's a little harder to sleep in general when you're pregnant. So she was toughing it out quite a bit.
All the more important to sleep in the armor when she's pregnant, though.
Right. Yep. All the more need for the breastplate or the stomach stretcher for that to fit. But, she's got the Smiths for that. She can handle it. So she twice fought off Dornish attackers that came for her brother, and fought off some that came for her, maybe while pregnant. We got that same math when we're considering when Aenys was actually conceived versus when he was actually born. Maegor's born in the year 10, so she was pregnant early year 10 or late year 9 or something like that, mid-year 9. So by the time this is happening, she's pregnant. She's been pregnant for a bit. And that might help explain something that was probably necessary anyway, the formation of the Kingsguard. That happened in the year 10 AC, right around the time Maegor was born. Very interesting to consider. Now, Visenya's saying, you gotta, your guards are slow, you need more work, you need to be protected. I'm cutting you in the face to prove this. We've talked about that before. Aegon finally agreed. And Visenya got it right. She said, he's like, well, okay, then we'll have a tournament, and the best warriors will become the first Kingsguard. She's like, no, you dummy. It's not about being the best warrior. It's about loyalty. Who will give their life for you? That's what we want. That matters more than skill. Of course, you don't want unskilled, kamikaze drone guards, but that's the number one is loyalty. Secondary is how good of a fighter they are. She's so right about that. And it's interesting that someone like Jaehaerys got that wrong. He was like, let's have a tournament. John Connington doesn't like Duck in Aegon the Sixth Kingsguard because he doesn't think he's a good enough fighter. But Aegon's like, Duck will die for me. That matters more. So this young Aegon, he gets it. He understands the point of the Kingsguard better than almost everyone who came in between him and Visenya, even though he's actually probably not part of their dynasty. Maybe he is. We'll count it for Blackfire purposes. He's a relative of Visenya, most likely.
I could see letting one or two people on the Kingsguard based on skill because it won some tournament or something.
Yeah,
but not all of them, and not the commander.
Not the commander. Yes, well said. Yeah, maybe one or two, just that way. It raises the overall profile. Oh, that guy's a member of that squad, and maybe their loyalty maybe makes him a little more loyal as well.
Yeah, and and the skilled ones might bring up the skill level of the other loyal ones too. Yeah. Right, someone to train with who's so expert or whatever.
And again, earlier I brought up how there wasn't much talk of poison, how Dornish are known for poison, and I don't think that's entirely deserved. It's not that they don't use poison. Well, the Red Viper certainly did many times, but he's just one guy, right? If you're gonna try to murder Aegon, Visenya, or these children, these royal children, don't you think that maybe poison would have been one of their... There's no word about it at all. No mention of poison. Maybe that's just because they never struck blows that would have allowed the poison to work. But you think he would have mentioned it. They attacked with poison blades, and Visenya... That just makes them sound like they avoided greater danger. That just makes them sound tougher.
Maybe they, whether true or not, the Dornish were party to the idea that Valyrians or Targaryens were immune to more poisons, and they were like, not worth our effort. Again, it doesn't have to be accurate,
right? Yeah, we know that's not true, but they may have believed it true.
Yeah, like if they fell prey to the propaganda.
Definitely hadn't thought of that. That's a very interesting point. Either way, though, the birth of Maegor in this year, it's another twist because we don't know when in the year it happened, and that would affect things. Like another child born would show that Visenya's even more concerned with security. She would be concerned anyway, and again, she would have been pregnant during some of these attacks and before them, so that would be on her mind, like, okay, my child is in danger. Now, I'm not saying she didn't care about 3-year-old Aenys. I'm pretty sure she did. Regardless of what happens later, I think she wasn't murderous towards her own family. I think that's pretty safe to say. Still, she's going to care about her own child more than her sister's child. Even if she's extremely fond of and loves baby Aenys. This is the child of her body, and she's probably going to care about him more.
She might even care more about her sister's child more now that she has her own.
Maybe she
understand the bond and importance even more. So.
Yes. I tell you, that was one of the times where you saying Aenys, how you say it, was very important in that sentence. She loves baby Aenys.
God.
God. Sorry, it's just okay.
Last night I was trying to come up with a title for the reign when we get to Aenys' reign, and I'm like, Aenys' mess or something like the mess left by Aenys.
No.
You won't let me name it that, will you?
Sometimes we get people in our comments that are like, why don't you say it like Eris instead of Ares? And it's because of Aenys, because we don't want to say anus constantly.
Yes, that's why.
That's why.
Other Targaryen names are pronounced a certain way to avoid saying anus.
Yeah, okay, anyways.
It all comes back to anus. Everything, all of it is built around that. So she'd be even more concerned with security. You could easily see why that would matter to her more. It would already have been important, but how this escalates, it's like, okay, now I'm also concerned with my child's life. And it may have also, Nina points out, maybe made her feel more a part of the dynasty. Like she was already maybe like the third wheel in some ways by being the one that Aegon favored her sister. On the other hand, Rhaenys is passed. So is Aegon now spending all those nights he spent with Rhaenys with Visenya? Is it like, are they together every night now just about since she's gone? Or is it he's still kind of like...
I would guess no.
I would guess no. He didn't like her as much. But he's still... And now there's a second baby. There's less need to father other children. There's an heir and a spare.
That's my other question. I mean, he was with Rhaenys like more than Visenya, right?
Yeah.
But like, how many nights did they just spend alone?
Good question.
That's the other question, because maybe he still spends those nights alone that he would have, but there is more time with Visenya because he still wants to,
Yeah. Another topic that is like the Kingsguard is one that we will fully flesh out another time. Not just is Visenya herself, not just her, but her rumors of her use of magic. Now, this is one of those things where she would not tamp down any rumors that result in her seeming more scary, more intimidating, because she liked to rule by fear. Like it's clear by how she advises Maegor later that she's very pro fear as a means of control, whereas maybe her brother and sister were less about that. They used it, but not to the extent that Visenya seemed to rely on. And yeah, so they might have felt the duty to have more children with Rhaenys dead, and they got one. Certainly, hoo boy, did they get one. Maegor, ooh, they might have, that's not exactly what they aimed for, I suppose. But they're also still in between, just burning all the castles in Dorne, like taking turns flying down there, burning a bunch of castles, while maybe one of them is ruling while the other flies down there to torch some castles. Then they take places, or switch places, and go back. So what is this? Like, burn a castle, check for surrender, burn a castle, check for surrender, and their plan is to repeat until it just ends. Well, it didn't, at least not because of that. That's not what caused it to end. The go until it sort of ends plan did not pan out. And meanwhile, the murders are still playing out. We got another year, the year 11 AC, just more people getting murdered, more people living in fear. The anxiety of that building, it snowballs, or sandballs, to use a Dornish term. I don't know. They're living in fear, and these lords can't govern their people properly. And what are they governing? Their lands are devastated. Their people are in hiding or dead. Again, like, how do you govern from a cave? What are you administering? What orders are you giving? To what farms are you telling to send? The farms are devastated. There's no one. There's less governing to do.
Incidentally, that is a third reason why Aegon may not have attacked Sunspear, is that he did want to rule Dorne.
Yeah.
And if he burns down their prized city and the rest of the country is already a blasted landscape, like, what's the point of even capturing
Where are you
Dorne?
going to surrender? So, yeah, where are we going to rule from afterwards? That's a good point. Yeah, you can't destroy it. Just turn the entire country into nothing, which is close to what he ended up doing anyway. But yeah, like, he may not have he probably thought they'd give up sooner than this. He was wrong, but he was...
Certainly, yeah.
And here's another interesting point. Talking about assassinations and poisoning, there's no evidence the faceless men were ever used, which kind of makes sense given their fees are scale rather than a flat amount. Like, yeah, you have to pay 80% of your wealth. Well, it's like,
I mean, they would ask for a dragon, right?
Yeah, they might. Well, the Targaryens, I don't think the faceless men would probably never.
They would not even accept it.
But the Dornish,
yeah,
I just don't know if. Yeah,
I feel like they would. I feel like the faceless men would be likely to accept a discount from the Dornish. In fact, because they were aligned in some ways. They'd be like, yeah, you get.
But apparently
half
it
price.
didn't happen. Apparently it didn't happen. They may have threatened to do it though, as something we'll talk about next episode. But as far as we know, they didn't actually do it. There's no evidence of that.
It is, once again, something that could have been done on a more individual level. Individual Dornish lords, or people who weren't necessarily even lords, just a farmer whose son was killed on getting a faceless man, and he could have given up 80% of his wealth, and history would never know about it. True. But it still could have gotten some key lord on the other side murdered.
Yeah, it just wasn't Aegon or Visenya, right. But it could have been Lord Connington, that one who he was killed. Probably not one of those Lords Hellholt, like we said, because it's probably not the faceless men. Probably weren't doing murders on behalf of the Targaryens or their allies. But it's still a consideration, and it's interesting to mention. Like, there's always things that a big part of what we do on the show is just to bring up things that aren't mentioned that maybe should have been mentioned, or at least we should wonder about. So the year 12 AC. This is basically the last year we're going to discuss today. We're going to basically barely touch on year 13. That's when things end. Things couldn't get much worse in Dorne. I'm calling this section still unbowed, unbent, maybe a little broken, though. But they still hadn't given up. Quote.
By then, Dorne was a smoking desert beset by famine, plague, and blight. A blasted land, traders from the free cities called it. Yet, House Martell still remained unbowed, unbent, unbroken, as their words avowed. One Dornish knight, brought before Queen Visenya as a captive, insisted that Miriam Martell would sooner see her people dead than slaves to House Targaryen. Visenya replied that she and her brother would be glad to oblige the princess.
The gloves are really off there now. That's just, oof. Pretty underrated statement there, huh, Sean? That's pretty evil.
And the unfortunate thing is that there's a third option, right? Why can't you be allies with the Targaryen? Now, I understand the answer why you can't at this point, especially, but she approached it from the get-go that we're either free or slaves. Well, is there something in the middle before you let all your people have their lands and homes and lives destroyed?
It's a big leap from free to slave. Like, there's definitely some in between there. The Targaryens, like you said, the Targaryens are just so invested now. Like, they've gone this far, they can't just back down based on their views of what would allow them to hold power. And if they lose here, if they lose in Dorne, then that, to them, in their minds, that gives license to the other kingdoms to challenge their rule as well. It's like, well, you weren't strong enough to defeat Dorne, even with all of the power of all the kingdoms behind you. It's a big loss. They don't want to take that loss. They don't want that on their rap sheet. It already looks bad, though, because they haven't been able to win. Even if they don't lose, they haven't won. And what are they going to do? What's left for the dragons to destroy? What strategy is going to change things. Like, what can they... Destroying everything didn't work. They didn't surrender when it says Dorne is a smoking desert beset by famine, plague, and blight. If that's not going to get them to give up, then what's left to torch to make them give? It's like, oh, now we'll give up. You destroyed the last tree, like what? I don't... It's clearly they're not going to give up, given what you're doing isn't going to work. The Dornish are fighting for freedom and homeland and revenge and all that. And despite all this devastation, despite how much damage has been inflicted on Dorne, Dorne's still very capable of causing great harm outside of their own borders. Quote,
"The most infamous act of that bloody age occurred in 12 AC, when Will of Will, the widow lover, arrived uninvited at the wedding of Sir John Caffrin, heir to Fontaine, to Alice Oakheart, daughter to the Lord of Old Oak. Admitted through a postern gate by a treacherous servant, the Will attackers slew Lord Oakheart and most of the wedding guests, then made the bride look on as they gelded her husband."
From there it gets worse. I didn't make Sean read the worst part of the quote. They assault the women and sell them all into slavery. And remember, folks, selling people into slavery ain't normal in Westeros. So this is another escalation here. And this is yet more evidence that the Dornish were working with certain elements in Essos. They sold those people into slavery not for the cruelty, but for more money to fund the war effort, most likely, or maybe both. They certainly wanted the money. And this was maybe sold to that pirate king, or using him as an intermediary, or some other pirate king, or just they have Lysine slave buyers there in Sunspear. They're just working with these folks openly. Who knows? But these slavers had to come from somewhere. They're not normally there to work with. So, yeah. And that's maybe to replace some of the trade that they lost, because they can't pretty much trade any other industry. Like, all the other things are shut down by Dragonfire and the destruction of the Planky Town. So slavery might be one of the few things left for some of those merchants coming from elsewhere to be like, well, we got no goods to buy. What about human goods? Ugh. As brutal as it is, it's a very human, like, historically supported style escalation. This is the kind of thing that happens. The longer a conflict drags on, the more hate is sowed, the more people are dehumanized, the more they become willing to inflict atrocities on others. You might think, and you're probably like me, if I did that to somebody else, I would have nightmares for the rest of my life. If I witnessed that, I would have nightmares for the rest of my life. Let alone, having it inflicted on you. Of course, that's the third option, which is the worst. But what if you've already been in a war like this for 8 to 10 years? You're already at the point you're having nightmares for the rest of your life. This is just changing the variety of those nightmares. Well, I'm going to have nightmares about torture and about Dragonfire and about sleeping in caves. So to someone that already has acquired a lifetime of trauma, adding a little more doesn't mean anything, or adds very little. Like, you're already kind of semi-broken. You're already accustomed. You've already normalized something that no human should have to normalize. And consider what the mental state of a veteran in this war, especially on the Dornish side, someone who's been involved in this since the beginning, what they've been through, what they've lost, what it must be like inside their mind. It must be like, if you're strong enough to hold on, if you're strong enough to keep going, well, that's amazing. But that doesn't mean you're not doing a lot internally to keep yourself going, to struggle against that trauma, to keep moving, to not just give up. So, brutal, really nasty, very realistic when you think about it that way. And that's what we try to do. We try to make this fantasy world as breathable as we can. And George, we have such a great floor for that because George does such a good job. Now, Fontaine is not on the map. We don't actually know where it is, except that it's in the Stormlands, likely on the border. It's likely in the marches. It's likely a longtime enemy of the Dornish. There's probably atrocities on both sides. Maybe not quite to this level, quite this brutal, but yeah, they've raided each other in the past. But probably not, maybe not these individuals. Maybe just their ancestors.
I can imagine the town not existing anymore. Yeah. You imagine a large percent of the population, the bloodline, the resources and everything of that town were at that wedding and were stolen away.
Well, House Caffrin still exists, so there is that. But yeah, maybe their power was permanently reduced because of that. We don't know how many men it was. Like, on one hand, a small group would be more efficient and subtle and easier to sneak in, but you need enough men to like be able to overpower like the fighters that are at the wedding, which would be several people. Like most of the men there would be trained in arms. They might have been ready for it, but they'd leap to action as best as they could when threatened. So eventually Walter will succeed the widow lover. This is his son. I wonder if he was part of this raid, if he was like one of the commandos that was at his side. The Will of Will is still remembered in Fontaine and in Old Oak to this day. Old Oak is way the hell over in the Reach. It's not particularly accessible to the Dornish. It's very much to the northwest within the Reach. But yet they still remember him because of this, because their son was gelded in front of the wedding guests. And, well, yeah, you don't forget that too easily, I don't suppose. So I think that probably there's still prejudice between the Oakharts and the Wills. Obviously, when Aerys Oakhart was in Dorne, he was constantly like, an Oakhart in Dorne. I need to be looking over my shoulder at all times, and he wasn't wrong. But he, of course, missed where the real danger was coming from. It's coming from inside your own bed, Aerys Oakhart. Yes, indeed. So quite an episode here with this invasion of Fontaine and this move by the Will of Will. Like, this is the kind of man that excels. When you have a war like this, the guy who is the best at escalating, the guy who's the cruelest, is the one who comes out on top. Like, the widow lover would never suffer any direct consequences for this, now or later. His family would. They would reap the consequences of his actions, but that's a tale for later because it's not soon. It's more than 15 years later. That's when he's going to die of old age. Never going to be brought to justice. But, man, that's what happens in real life sometimes. Sometimes the worst people get away with things, and of course in Dorne he wouldn't be viewed as a bad guy. He'd be viewed as a freedom fighter to most, as a hero, and in some ways he was. Not for this though. Not for this. I don't think this helped move the needle on the war at all. I don't think so. But one person who did die very shortly after this, that did change the war, and by change it I mean end it, the death of Miriam Martell. After all this, of all things, it was just simply old age. So somewhat anticlimactic, but very realistic. She just died of old age, and her family was like, we would like to do things differently. Her heirs had a different plan. Not quite the same as stubborn, tough Miria. And by the way, Nina writes, the deathbed slander against Miria's supposed sexual activities is an obvious reference to the same equally untrue story about Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia. Similar tales about her told about, horses and crazy stuff like that. Yes, bestiality that is almost certainly not true, but does make for scandalous rumors and the kind of stories that people still talk about 500 years later. Also true in Westeros, although more like 300 years later. Still quite a long time. And yeah, so that's all that was needed. Wild, right? Like, it wasn't Aegon succeeding. It wasn't some great strategy. It wasn't some new plan. It wasn't some opportunity that they seized upon. It was just the leader dying of old age. That's what changed it all. And if you're a Targaryen, you're like, well, if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. If you're a Dornish person, it depends on where you're at. If you wanted peace, you might be like, well, I'm not going to say this out loud, but I'm kind of glad she died. But if you wanted to keep going, well, then you didn't want this at all. You did not want her passing, but you couldn't have been surprised for a 90-plus-year-old person to die.
And, this was a win, if you will, for the people, because it at least paused the war. But the Targaryens still didn't get Dorne. It still wasn't really the goal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just a pause in hostilities. So, and maybe a little lucky on the part of everyone involved. Really, the heir to Meria didn't want to keep going. Wasn't also personally motivated to get revenge. This could have continued to drag on easily.
Yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. Several questions here from y'all today. I'm glad to see that. We inspired some extra discussion in the comments. Dornish Dame says, do find it interesting with this cycle of vengeance that the member of House Alder we know best in the main series wants to end that cycle, Ilari. Yes, and we did an episode on Ilari, and we did make that point. I also thought that was interesting. She and of course we theorized that was part of why, that being so close to that, being at the epicenter of cycles of vengeance, is where you might find someone that has the wisdom to see the better way, to see why it should stop, to look at it from a higher point of view and say, when is this going to stop? Like, you are out here, like, Tywin died by his own son painfully, and you want more. Like, damn, like, it's really never going to end if that's not enough for you. Yeah.
Sometimes you need that person who themselves has motivation for revenge to be the one to not seek it, to get other people to fall in line.
Very good point. Yeah, like, if I don't want revenge, then what are you all on about? You know, I'm the one who truly suffered here. You know, me meaning Ilaria in this case, was my husband that died. My lover died. Yes, to you he's the Red Viper. To you he's this and that, but he was my lover and the person who knew me best, and I was the person who knew him best. So I know better than you what he wanted and what he didn't want. Yeah. Amy Collins Russell says, look up the board game Flamecraft. Is that in reference to dragons, like, making things and building stuff?
Ooh, yeah.
Yeah, there's this. All the next ones are about that.
Oh, cool. We really inspired some things with that one, huh? Wheezy Squeezebox says, a team of dragons pulls the devil god's sleigh across the sky until the end of the moon. Is that a game or a story?
No, it's a Chinese, I believe Chinese, but it's a fantasy TV show that Wheezy Squeezebox has been promoting in our chat for quite a while now.
Cool.
So anyone who is in our chat has seen those words before. But yeah, an example in there.
Very good. Ad Z says, hi all, great discussion as always. On the subject of dragons being used in other ways, take giants that help the children of the forest build the wall. Yeah, very good point. That is a very good point. They were used for that, or the rumor is very strong there. I believe it. And we certainly wondered about, like, did the dragons help build the Valyrian dragon roads? Like, they're so long and big. Yeah, we've talked about things like that before. Maybe the fused walls. Yeah. Very possible, and a good parallel. Phil H says, when DHL started, it stood for Dragon Hauling Logistics. But since dragons went extinct, they had to change that. Nice one, Phil. Like that. Very good. Sean, you pulled out a few names for us here to thank some patrons for their support. A few somewhat at random here. Who do you got today?
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of this community is these names that we get, these mashes of people's interests into the world of Westeros. And somewhat at random, but I've been making an effort to get some new and some old.
Nice.
Got Black Matos, Storm Rider, Captain of the Rusted Hinge.
By the way, I ran into Black Matos Storm Rider at MagFest last week. It's our good friend
cool.
Matt. Yeah, his name really is Matt McSorley. Yeah.
Another one of my favorite parts of this community is running into people in real life.
Yeah.
That's a great part of cons. I mean. Jeremy Flowers, proprietor of the Mummer Troop Old Town Funk. That would be my favorite Mummer Troop for sure.
Yeah, that's good.
Aileen Archer, Queen Captain of the Border Collie.
Yeah. You said it right. That is how you say her name. I said Eileen for many weeks, months, years, and she corrected me one day. You got it right on the first try. Good job.
I think it was at least partly luck. So, Grant of Hawksight, Watcher of the God's Eye.
Hawksight, that's cool.
Alder Snow, Bastard of Bear Island, known as the Northern Fury, as fierce as she is loyal.
Cool.
And finally, this week we've got Wisdom Mindax, Bastard of Starfall.
Wisdom sounds like a Wheel of Time reference. Probably is. Either way, it's cool. It's a cool title, even if that wasn't the intended reference.
Wisdom's and
is that what they call the pyromancers?
Yeah, wisdom, Halloween.
Oh, my bad. Yeah, you're totally right.
They
do. You're right. Oof, goof. Okay, probably a pyromancer. Never mind. Cut that.
I will cut that.
You will. It's funny. You can find all these Patreon names, whether interpreted correctly by me or not, at historyofwesteros.com, along with everything else we mentioned throughout this episode. If you want to find a link, if you want to find past episodes, if you want to sign up for something, if you want to use our affiliate links, if you want to peruse one of our sponsors, historyofwesteros.com. It's not fancy, but it's got everything that you need to link to all the places that we may have referred to.
People who listen on podcasts are going to be like, what do they mean by Aziz interpreting names correctly? Because I'm going to cut that. And now you have a reference to a thing I'm going to cut. Aziz interpreted all the patron names to mean jerk.
Yeah, everything means jerk. Wisdom, that means jerk. Hawksite, jerk. Bear Island, jerk. Archer, Queen, Cap, jerk. Border Collies, those are all jerks. The jerkiest
that's
dogs.
What happened.
Yeah.
I cut it, but now he's back doing it again up to his old tricks.
I'm making it hard.
Yeah.
Making Yeshaya's job
Jerk,
harder.
the jerk of House Jerk.
To be found at the jerk store. That's right. The trivia answer. The question was, what title created by Aegon was held by only one person ever? That is the Warden of the Sands, held by John Rosby. Yes, he did plummet to his death, thanks to Miria and her knights. Next week, we'll be discussing the peace deal, the mystery of the letter of Rhaenys, whether Rhaenys lived, and all the associated stuff. The letter from Dorne is one of the most interesting and popular mysteries from this era, and I want to devote a little extra time to it, but also setting up some of the other things that happen around it, discussing some of the other things that happen around that same time in the era, and then we'll move on to the rest of Aegon's reign, and we'll go from there. We also have some episodes that relate to ones we talked about today. We mentioned Alaria Sand just now. We mentioned Nymeria, parts 1 and 2. Eventually, we'll do the part 3. That's one of the things that might happen during the Topics Moot. Nymeria 3 might get some extra steam behind it as a project for us to finish. We've also mentioned Daeron the First episode. We mentioned the Doom episode, the Century of Blood episode. We mentioned Under the Dragon's High Tower, which is where you can find more information, a much more detailed take on the invasion in 8 AC or 9 AC of Night Song and the invasion of Joffrey Dane around Old Town. We go into a lot more detail about those incidents in Under the Dragon's High Tower. Also, Hardcore Houses came up. Highgarden came up. Really, just a lot of stuff. Now, don't forget, the Last Storm episode is available to patrons and members only. There's lots of other episodes you get by joining our Patreon. I've lost count. There's so many bonus episodes you get by signing up for Patreon, and it's such a small amount relative to how many episodes you get. I hope you think it's a good deal, and if so, join us on Patreon today. Patreon.com/HistoryWesteros. Another episode you can get is The Red Kraken. Another one you can get is the Buildings of Brandon, meaning the Buildings of Brandon the Builder. That relates to our discussion of giants helping build the wall. We have a whole episode on that. One that's available for patrons and one that's just out there. When Giants Roamed, with our good friend Amanda, a.k.a. Crowfood's daughter. Thank you for those of you who attended live and made the chat bumpin'. We always appreciate that. Thanks as well to those of you who have signed up to support us, not just on Patreon, but on Spotify. We do have Spotify subscriptions available as well. It doesn't quite have the functionality of Patreon. We can't quite offer all the same things, but you get the bonus episodes, and it's a little easier if you're already subscribed to Spotify. You can just add that on to your monthly fee and then forget about it. So in some ways, it's a little simpler than Patreon, even if it doesn't quite have the same benefits. But we're not in charge of how any of that stuff works. We just do what we can to provide you all as many options as possible to support the show. For other options, check out our website. Thanks very much to Nina. Go check out goodqueenally.tumblr.com. Thanks as well to Joey and Jesse and Bran and Michael Klarfeld for our music and for our video intro and our maps. So good, so helpful. Makes our show look so professional. Yes. What we can't pull off, we fake it with the help of friends. Yes. Until next time, my friends, you know what to do. We'll be back with more Valar Re-Regis.